Olá, bom dia, sejam todos
Good
bem-vindos.
morning. Welcome to the 7th Fórum ABIIS, the future of the medical device sector in Brazil. It will be a morning of intense debate and important discussions about the challenges the sector is facing and what we can expect for the near future. Your participation is very important and it is key so we can together enrich this debate. So thank you for your presence, for your participation, that you can improve by sending your questions, your comments through the chat. You are all invited to subscribe to ABIIS channel on YouTube and follow us in the social media and be up to all the activities ABIIS carries out over the year. So let's start by thanking the partnership of our supporters, institutional supporters, USAID, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the Medical Technology Sector. Thank you. And to start off, I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Carlos Eduardo Gouveia, the President of ABIIS Board of Administration. Please, Mr. President, take your seat. Also, I'd like to invite to be a part of our stage sorry, we had a problem with Andrea's connection, but soon Adriana Ventura, the federal congresswoman, will be with us. And now I would like to invite Ms. Daniela Marreco Cerqueira, the Deputy Administrator of the Third Directory of the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency and VISA. Welcome, Ms. Director. And as soon as we have our Congresswoman back, I would ask the IV team to let me know. For the initial conversation that introduced our event, I would like to invite then Mr. Carlos Eduardo Gouveia to get started. The floor is yours. Good morning. It's a pleasure for ABIIS to be with another event where we have the opportunity of bringing a new perspective to the health sector. The importance of medical device and diagnosis is more than clear after a pandemic as we had. Before that, nobody knew what was molecular biology, and today you can ask anyone and they will explain what a PCR is, how to collect the sample and all that. The matter of the ventilators and so many sophisticated technologies that before we had no idea, and now they are part of our day by day. Maybe for a tragic reason and so painful reason, but it allowed us to look back at our perspective of the health sector from this perspective, and that's what ABIIS wants with this event, to bring the importance of medical device inside the value chain of health and discuss how we can and we should look ahead. This pandemic, unfortunately, was not the first and will not be the last. The context of One Health has to be more valued and observed inside the public policy decision-making process. Human and animal and environmental health are interconnected. Today, a person can leave Hong Kong and get to the other side of the world in 24 hours. And together with them, together with the several planes, 1, 2, 3 planes they will get here, they can carry pathogens as well. So the matter of contamination and the spread of some risk situations is more than frequent. The matter of mitigating the logistic breach is something else we have to discuss. Logistic chain existed and we thought they were not perfect maybe, but working well. And what we realized is that no, we were far from that. If it weren't an integrated and joint action from the civil society with the actor like Anvisa, and we have the privilege of hearing them talk about their efforts and how they are looking ahead. And the matter of this health, the Ministry of Health, the health secretaries, and SUS working in their different levels inside the context of the three-party existence, this effort wouldn't have happened, but it's not enough. We need an effort in research, development, and innovation, a strong academia that is ready to deal with the new challenges and be able to change the key in an industrial context minimally. What we heard a lot in the past years, and I'm going to show you in the afternoon, is the need for you to have new productive arrangements. It's not a policy of replacing imports, it's not that, but having the minimum capacity of production because it's locally strategic. And within this context, using it as a factor to promote economy and develop the economy of the nations. So this was a point in the Summit of the Americas. It's something we've heard, and it's a part of an intelligent regulation. And in this sense, this is what we are seeing with Anvisa that is engaged in this discussion. The harmonization may not be possible, but the regulatory convergence is really important, and it is the topic of different forums. So bringing a little of this big challenge of discussing regulation, good regulatory practices, predictability in the legal aspect, and the minimum of a favorable environment for flourishing this industry that is key for innovation here in Brazil and in the region will be a little of what we are going to address here today. I would like then to invite Dr. Daniela Marreco for giving her, oh, sorry, Adriana is here. Great. So Daniela, just a minute. Let's just say hello to the Congresswoman Adriana Ventura, who is one of the big supporters of innovation, entrepreneurship, and she has a topic in Congress and not only is a part of the health and society, but briefly, she's part of the mixed parliamentary uh, unity against corruption. So she deserves our support. And I thank Adriana for your effort of being here with us today in the opening of this important event. The floor is yours.
Bom, primeiramente,
First off, it's a pleasure to be with you. I apologize that I'm connecting now through a different device.
Estão me vendo bem?
Estamos ouvindo com um pouco de eco, mas dá para
We
ouvir.
can hear you with an echo, but we can't see you.
Do ponto de eco que eu estou com questões técnicas aqui.
I have some technical issues, but now let's see if we can work. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone. Thank you, Carlos Gouveia, for this event, for this initiative, the Brazilian Alliance for Innovative Health Industry. Promoting this discussion is very relevant for this sector. We know, we have seen during the pandemic how much it is important to talk about innovation, technology, and talk about an agile administration and to promote innovation. So we know technology exists and it has to be serving humanity to optimize processes, to improve people's lives. I'm the author of the telemedicine law, and I can tell you clearly that the National Congress has put a lot of effort to meet that demand. And that's not an easy subject. We know that innovation brings resistance. We know that any innovation forces us humans to adapt to the new times, and that generates resistance from all types. And the adaptation period is very necessary because sometimes this resistance is something that we see in the market. Sometimes we are bothered by what can get in the way of our modus operandi. But this forum of debate, this space you are creating here
agilidade,
to
trazer
bring agility, to bring innovation, because the main issue,
da legislação, né?
the
E da
thing is,
legislação.
practice comes before regulation. So how can we adjust that? And I wonder,
Agora,
as
o que
lawmaker, what the Congress can do, how the Congress can help, how can the Congress unlock the business environment, not getting in the way, and how can we promote regulations with agility? How can we provide predictability for the sector? We know health sector besides treatment, and we have talked a lot about prevention, but how
da
this
saúde, que é
area,
tão importante,
which is so important, can bring more business? How can it bring more wealth? How can it provide more employment? We have technology, we have device, we're talking about medical device. How can we promote research, capacitation, and debureaucratize the process? So this is space, and so I thank again the event by the Brazilian Alliance for Innovative Health Industry, and I see everyone here and Visa, and I'm so excited to hear Daniela speak, because how can we gather our efforts, joint efforts, in a way to advance in the sector? So I'm at your service. The Parliamentary Front for Telehealth is available for seminars and conversations, and my room, my office and other offices are available for you. Thank you, Dr. Carlos Gouveia, and I thank the opportunity of speaking in this event. Thank you. Excellent, Adriana. I believe your talk was very welcome, and it brings a lot of elements to our discussion during the day. The point of telemedicine brought a new frontier, and then we have the interoperability, data integration, safety, and the intelligent use of data for the ones that really matter, the patients. So this, I think, will be one of the challenges, and for ANVIS and the whole sector, for getting forward a sustainable and smart way to bring economy to the health. So I think this is one of the points. We are all actors working in favor of public health in the country. Well, now I'd like to invite Dr. Daniela Marreco, the Deputy Administrator of the Third Directory of the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, for her initial comments.
Bom dia, muito obrigada, Carlos.
Good morning. Thank you, Carlos. And I thank on behalf of Anvisa and Alex Machado Campos, the director, for the invitation of the Brazilian Alliance for Innovative Health Industry, for the invitation to participate in this event. And on my behalf, I'd like to thank for being in this opening round. Thank you, Carlos and Bruno, for having this opportunity and being able to interact with you in such an interesting and relevant topic. I would like to thank the Congresswoman Adriana Ventura, because her words are very relevant and they show how much the Congress is concerned about the regulation and how can we work together to contribute to advance in the sector that is so important for the country. This is an amazing and huge sector. We're talking numbers, over 15,000 companies, 70,000, now 80,000 products that are registered. So it shows the relevance and the size of the sector. And how can we, as a regulatory agency, as this body, to work in the sector that is characterized by innovation, technology, in a way that we can allow the advances in this sector, the access of patients to products with quality and safety, and on the other hand, without impacting innovation. So I believe one of the main challenges when we talk of innovation is how regulation can keep pace of innovation. So how can we maintain standards that leave room for innovation that is quicker than the speed of the agency in regulating all that. We know the regulation process is not easy, and all steps of good regulatory practices are required and they are important. when you talk about intelligent regulation, you bring the importance of analyzing the regulatory impact, and that is essential because in the agency, we don't know what's going on in the factories, we don't know what's going on the edge, on the service that is using the medical devices. So we really need to interact with all the agents, all the parties that are affected by standards. We have to interact with the citizen. And how can we do that in a situation that we know has a limitation of human resources like the agency has? So we have the same people analyzing the processes, building the standards, and we know, as the Congresswoman says, that we need agility. Our standards need to be agile. And that's something that distressed me with the time that Anvisa takes to regulate something. I think this is a challenge we have to overcome. And how can we bring all these aspects of good regulatory practice and having a regulatory impact analysis, a robust one? How can we act on this whole process? So we have to work on that to really be able to conjugate all the factors and bring regulation that is intelligent and that allow for innovation and that can maintain the characteristics of the sector, so people can have at Anvisa the assurance of quality and safety in these processes and products. As you all mentioned, regulatory convergence is another aspect that has to be embedded in our rules. We can't, in a globalized world, having 70% of our products being imported. How can each country have a different demand and companies to adjust to each country's specificities to work for the same product? It's the same product being used by by patients. So the standards have to be convergent to facilitate, make things easy for industry and for the agencies. We have to use this shared knowledge. We know there are several agencies that are in the same standard of work, and we can share knowledge, we can exchange experience and make use of the analysis that were done, so we can bring agility, which is so needed, and the regulatory intelligence as well. So I think this is one of the challenges we have to discuss. And as I saw in your documents, there are several proposals for us to go and advance on that. Another aspect is the pandemic of COVID-19. And now we are going through monkeypox that's bringing other challenges. But on the other hand, I think we learned, the agency and the sector, together we learned a lot, and now we have baggage to really face this emergency from a different perspective. I believe we are better prepared. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, we had, in the early days, we had meetings in the agency when the cases were in China. I said, we will not be able to handle this emergency, and we went through. And I said that we did holding hands. The sector advanced a lot. The national sector was able to bring PPEs and ventilators and diagnosis kits. And as an agency, we analyzed over 1,100 kits, and we were able to check so many people that were bringing the dilemma of ensuring the quality, the safety of the product, and the access in a situation of extreme need. Now with monkeypox, we have diagnosis kits and we are facing the same challenge again, and we have to provide quick and safe answers, because now, as Carlos mentioned, people know what PCR is. Our children know what we do before they didn't. And so the agency grew. It is now known, and it brings an aspect that we always have to be well supported and based to respond to society. At the same time, we are well known, we are charged more. So any new diagnosis kit that is made available by the agency, we have to respond. Why? So we have this challenge now to respond to society. And I believe the COVID-19 pandemic is something that we have to bring the impact it brought to the medical sector, the surgeries that were canceled and how it impacts the production, how it impacts the gain of the sector that is recovering and is growing. And what changes happen today? The population and the professionals, the healthcare professionals, are really using telemedicine, as the Congresswoman mentioned, the diagnosis tools, and for remote treatment. People look for that kind of tools, and the sector has to keep up with this observation and make available new technologies that respond to the new formats that the pandemic brought. A virtual format. We are here in this forum, which is an example of how we can make this conjugation of an event that is hybrid, and at the same time, the health sector is going through this moment of transition and innovation with new products that are being expected by the health sector and by the population.
So this brought an important revolution that we as agency, we need to follow. We need to allow the access to make sure that we have the quality and the safety of these products. So I think this was what I wanted to say, to welcome you all, to put the agency available for you, to thank you, our technicians. They are so competent to answer to what we need, and to say that we are available to build together with the sector this smart regulation that you have mentioned, and that I really believe on that. Thank you very much. Great, Dr. Daniela, I thank you for speaking. To us, it's a relief and it's a comfort to say that we can continue and will continue working side by side with the agency, trying to find solutions that are suitable for the population, that are sustainable in the business point of view, and that can bring this opportunity to generate knowledge, development, local development, and especially to enhance what we have. For COVID pandemic, it was a learning process. Monkeypox is here. And one of the associates of ABIIS, CBDL, that had with other entities, Abramed and other entities that are societies in the lab world, we had the first program to assess the kids for coronavirus. The idea was to have information for the market, for the public or private sector, what was the performance, what we could expect from those kids, for the Brazilian health regulatory agency, if we had some problem, how we could improve that. And the third point was to give for the manufacturer or the importer that idea of what they would need to do to improve the product in the next acquisition and this continuous improvement. Because of the monkeypox, we are getting back to this process, as at the time we are going to present the project for Anvisa to support in the decisions and also to the market with 13 public and private labs for the Federal University from Rio and the hospital from São Paulo and other areas throughout the country. And we need to get this effort for the society. And last, I think that is a great challenge, is to be together with the new technologies that are appearing. Just in Google, for you to have an idea, we have 120 million questions asked about health per day, per day. So the Dr. Google is there, it exists, it's not regulated, but it exists, it gives some type of information. How we can move forward. This is our challenge, not only as a software, as a medical device, but for all the new technologies that are getting here. I thank you all for being part of this program that we have here. I'd like to thank the Congresswoman Adriana Ventura that gave us great speech about this journey, and from the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, Dr. Daniela Marreco, that brought great challenges and that we accept these challenges to work together. Thank you very much. And now our session is open from ABIIS, the future of the medical device in Brazil. We thank you, Dr. Presidency, for your words and everyone that were part of this opening session. So in a very kind way, we'd like to invite you to take your seats in the audience so we can move on, going to the first session for this event. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Congresswoman Daniela Ventura, that was with us with remote participation, and also the presentation of Dr. Daniela Marreco from Anvisa, and also President Carlos Gouveia for leading this session that opened this day. So we're going to have the first session that we work with the regulatory convergency as a development tool. This is the main topic that will guide the discussion this first session. So I'd like to invite, before we create here the session, I'd like to invite you to participate remotely. You can ask your questions, you can send your comments, what you're thinking, you can participate through our chat. So now I'd like to invite the speakers, starting with Ms. Sandra Ligia Gonzalez, please. This is the Executive Secretary, Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergency in the Medical Technology Sector. Welcome, Ms. Sandra Ligia, in our stage. I'd like to invite you to come to the stage, Mr. Augusto Geyer. He is the Deputy General Manager of the Medical Device General Office of Anvisa. Welcome, Mr. Manager, Mr. Augusto Geyer, and also to invite to the stage, Mr. Marcos Aurelio Lima de Oliveira. Marcos is the President Advisor in the Brazilian National Institute of Metrology, Standardization, and Industrial Quality in Metro. And to mediate the session, our first session, I'd like to invite Mr. José Márcio Cerqueira. He's the Executive Director from ABIIS, and he will moderate this first session. So to start this, please, Mr. José Márcio Cerqueira. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for being here. So to say to Daniela, I thought it was amazing what you have said. It's great to see the evolution of the agency in the last years. It's amazing the work that you have been doing. I'm really proud of our agency. So congratulations and thank you very much. This event was conceived so we can do two analyses: how it is, our manufacturing in health, and what are the challenges that we have to have a better future for the medical device sector, as we have some issues, some problems with the pandemic. And one of the tools that ABIIS believes, that Alliance believe, that one of the best is the regulatory convergency. Aligned with that, we have a global chain, and a lot of time we have a regulation that doesn't talk to one another. Even though we have international forums, for example, not always this regulation converges. So now, our three guests of this session, we have some presentations. I will start with Ms. Sandra Ligia, so she can start and we can move on. If you have questions throughout the session, please. If you say that if you have a party and you don't break any glasses, it's not a party. So if you have questions, you can send it through the chat and we can ask the questions here. Have a good event. So Sandra, please.
Thank you very much. And my apologies that I am not capable of speaking Portuguese. So sorry. And I want to start by thanking the invitation. We're really very honored to participating here. We are 100% convinced that regulatory convergence is something that it is really mandatory for the world to really leverage the available resources and to take advantage of the very many good experiences that regulatory agencies such as Anvisa have taken, and that the world can really learn about that, and the world can really learn about each other. And the name of the game is really for us, regulatory convergence. Can I get the next slide, please? So I'd like to start by sharing you a little bit of what we know as the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. This is an initiative that was born because basically how we were shocked because of COVID-19 pandemic. This is a public-private endeavor that comprises efforts from the government of the United States through the USAID that also brings into the picture ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, ABIIS, the Advanced Medical Technology Association of the United States that conveys most of the biggest global manufacturers of medical devices, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. The project is taking over activities that are considering several countries in Latin America, like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. We cover some countries in Asia, that are Vietnam and Indonesia, and of course, Africa, considering Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. Some of the key elements of the project had to do with what we had to realize at the very beginning of the pandemic that has to do with the vulnerability that the supply chain for medical devices has, in how the need for agile opportunities in the regulatory environment as to make it accessible devices that were in extremely urgent need worldwide. I mean, there was no country that was an exception because of this situation. And from there, it became more and more evident, something that we already knew, that had to do with the barriers that might be created because of the lack of regulatory convergence. Therefore, the project is intending to tackle these specific topics through several tools that are in place and that we are implementing throughout these project countries. And we have divided our work in a couple of tiers. Tier one that has to do with the implementation of good regulatory practices on a horizontal scheme. And then what we call the tier two activities that are related specifically to the medical device sector. And in that regard, a lot of our effort has to do with capacity building, because we understand that knowledge, access to information are key elements as to define long-lasting effects on what we are doing. And in that regard, we have organized our work to couple with technical procedural challenges, and them also organize us to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic that unfortunately we have not overcome yet, but also how to be better prepared as to recover from that. And as we were just listening, I mean, we are now facing the next pandemic. So how are we going to be leveraging the lessons that we have learned out of COVID-19 as to be better prepared for tackling with additional pandemics? And not only tackle additional pandemics, because there are lots of lessons that we have learned that can have a very positive impact on our day-to-day activities. I mean, not only from the regulator's perspective, but also as from the private sector perspective. And in that regard, again, a long-lasting effect can be achieved by developing capacity among all stakeholders that are involved in our sector. It is not only a unique responsibility for the regulators, it is really a shared responsibility from the private sector as well as regulators, as for us to build a much stronger, reliant regulatory environment for our day-to-day and of course to tackle additional pandemics. So in that regard, what the project has done also through the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence is developing a lot of capacity building activities like workshops, webinars, and all of these activities, all of these materials that are conveying all relevant stakeholders are available to the public, both regulators, private sector, through a couple of websites that we have developed and that you will be able to reach once these presentations are made available through the web addresses that we have included in here. And so I'll touch a little bit on what we're doing in some of the countries in Latin America. In Brazil is kind of like in a unique situation within the project, because Brazil has really developed great examples on how to implement and to take agile decisions as to tackle the crisis that we were all facing. And in that regard, Brazil and Visa and several agencies in the government have been really very helpful participating in several of the activities that we have developed as to help other regulators and the industry elsewhere in Latin America to learn about the good things and the good results that have been in place. Brazil is really having a leading role, of course, being a member of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum that helps kind of like paving the way for a lot of Latin American countries as to start getting into a more structured path towards regulatory convergence. Brazil takes a very active role into the internalization of international standards, and of course, in regards of the implementation of good regulatory practices at the several and many agencies in the country. To give you an idea of the type of work that we are doing also with Colombia, that all has to do with starting with developing capacities, implementing good regulatory practices in order to tackle specific technical challenges. Like for Colombia, we're working with them in several work streams, first one being the update of the regulation for medical devices and IVDs, also developing regulation for good manufacturing practices that they do not have in place as we speak. Also developing regulation for clinical evaluation of medical devices and emergency use authorization. You're probably aware Colombia faced a lot of challenges while tackling the pandemic, and there's the need that has been acknowledged by the regulators in regards of the need for this. And all of that based on long-lasting elements that are the procedural related ones. And the Ministry of Health has just issued a publication on the procedures that they are going to be implementing as to ensure compliance with international obligations in regards of good regulatory practices. For Mexico, we have several work streams that also have to do initially with implementation of good regulatory practices. And we're working with COFEPRIS and the Mexican Pharmacopoeia that are like two branches that regulate on medical devices. As for them to implement a checklist, again, to reconfirm, to ensure that proper good regulatory processes are in place and that international obligations are met while developing their process. And we're working also with them in several other topics that are critical, again, for the availability and a proper response for regulatory challenges. For Peru, thinking on talking about good regulatory practices, they do have in place their regulation as for a review on a tri-annual basis of the procedures that are in place. And this year is the year that is required to revise all the procedures that are related to medical devices. And this is a great opportunity because through those, we can pursue further alignment, further convergence with international standards and references. And well, lastly, kind of like some takeaways. I mean, we are talking about here a core responsibility. It is all stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders that are responsible for supporting and for conveying activities that are going to be helping us to move forward into the regulatory convergence pathway. So this is an invitation for all of us to develop our competencies on good regulatory practices, on international standards, on international references, to take advantage of the already existing legal obligations of the countries in regards of implementation of good regulatory practices, but moreover for our sector while implementing the recommendations from the World Health Organization in regards of good regulatory practices and of course on good reliance practices as well. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Sandra.
Thank you, Sandra. We are receiving a lot of questions.
Eu vou combinar uma coisa com vocês. As perguntas que a gente não conseguiu.
The questions that we are not able to answer here, I will send to the authority or to the guest here,
Para quem a pergunta foi dirigida e
or for the person that the question was sent.
passo agora a palavra para Augusto Gaia, gerente.
So now we have the Augusto Gaia,
Tecnologia de produtos para a saúde, substituto.
the General Manager of Medical Device General Office. Welcome, Augusto. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you all, José Márcio, Carlos, Bruno, for inviting me for Anvisa to participate of this event. It's quite important to be involved and to follow and to have the chance to release what we have been doing in Anvisa in the area for medical device. So I will have a presentation. I have a few slides addressing what Anvisa is working with for the regulatory convergency as a tool, and what are the actions and some perspectives that we have for the future.
Bom, então, apenas como uma
So just as a quick introduction, I believe many of the people here know what are the main activities of the general medical device management. So we are working for the notification, renewal, and alterations of the petitions for medical devices. We work with the medical devices and we provide information about the regulated products for the audience, for the internal users of Anvisa as well, and we provide technical support for activities of inspection, technovigilance, health services, and for ports, airports, and borders in terms of product imports. One of the main activities that we carry out is the participation in national and international forums that work with the regulation of medical devices. And whenever possible, Anvisa is always looking for participating and being involved in these kind of actions. And finally, it is the promotion of the regulatory convergence, something that we have as an important mission and that allows us to have more fluidity in this process for the Brazilian market. Just to illustrate the importance of the regulatory convergence for Brazil, for the regulation of health products in Brazil, this slide shows how much Anvisa and Brazil receives of imported products of other markets. So Brazil is responsible for around 30% of the registrations of health products produced internally, but the other 70% are produced in other countries. So mainly US, China, Germany, Italy, and France. I'm sorry, I went through too many slides. Let me go back. So this allows us to show the reflex on the commercial scale of medical device, and this is something I got from ABIIS, showing the value that we have in financial terms of important health products and how much they are national and the capacity Brazil has of exporting, producing good health products and allowing its competition in the international market. When we organize these registration and notifications of health products in Brazil, we realize there is a proportion for risk classes 1 and 2, and a smaller proportion for the risk classes 3 and 4, in a total of around 81,000 registration notifications, encompassing a wide variety of products in this universe of medical devices. And considering the diversity of products and the Brazilian capacity of production and the possibility of relating international and national manufacturers in a globalized world, regulatory convergence is a mandatory topic for the agency in terms of medical device. So we have here the participation of Anvisa in the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, and we participate in different initiatives of harmonization inside the Mercosur market and the participation of Anvisa in a very interesting case in the medical device single audit program, and I'm going to comment a little more about it later on. We have context with the World Health Organization. We always try to adopt their guidelines and recommendations. We also participate in the process of standards with ISO and IEC, and bilateral agreements with other regulating agencies that we have contact in different countries. So this is something that allows us to have a good relationship with different markets and different regulatory structures, allowing us to obtain good examples and bringing the use inside the Brazilian market. IMDRF is probably one of the main forums that Anvisa has worked with to internalize regulations and adopt strategic regulations. This is a forum that has the participation of regulators, not only the founders, but other regulators around the world. And in this slide, we have the main active groups that are now active inside IMDRF. One of the main activities we have worked with is inside the regulator product submission, a technical group that allows and discusses the requirements in terms of documents and technical aspects to regulate medical devices with the members that comprise IMDRF. And inside the context that are published by IMDRF, we have always looked for implementing them for the national regulation. And here is a list of the main documents that have been internalized or are in process of being. So you have the UDI, the Unique Device Identification, that was published in the RDC 691. It's a long-term process, so there are some years for its application. We have the update of the essential requirements of DM development and safety. So we have a signaling for the next directory meeting for having the publication of this public consultation very soon. We have an update of the risk classification rules. This is a project that has some years and it worked in parallel with Mercosur. So these risk classification rules are aligned with what the European regulation practices. And it's something that is going to be applied for the Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay markets as well. About the review of the RDC 185, we have the conditions now of forwarding it in September, October, to conclude the process. We also have the adoption of the submission formats for the regulated product submission. This is something that has been worked. It depends on a series of matters that involve, including the programming in terms of IT. We have the regulation of software as a medical device. This is very recent. It's the RDC 657 of 2022, and it's in practice. The regulation of a personalized medical device that started in 2019, and it's the RDC 305. We also have the participation of Anvisa in the development group of technical standards. So we have a group of IMDRF that is standards working group, and Anvisa has actively participated and is involved more and more in the development of, together with ISO and other institutions. And just to mention very briefly, we have some technical guidelines for clinical investigation, evidence and evaluation. We have guideline of cybersecurity for medical device, and something that is for the medical device single review program, an ambitious project, but it's on its early days. Just to illustrate a successful case, which is MDSAP, which is a program that allows companies to receive one single audit for good manufacturing practices, and is worth for several markets. So the founding members are Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and USA, and those who use the certificates to regulate their good manufacturing practices. MDSAP relies on 3 observant members: European Unit, United Kingdom, and the World Health Organization, and affiliate members, Argentina, Israel, and South Korea. And so now we have 6,300 fabrication units that are certified. And it's a program that is growing and has reached a very high success. We rely a lot on the process and how it brings good results. Now, the main point is, what are the main challenges of regulatory convergence for the future? And from the perspective of DGTPS is to have a naming for a medical device that is unique, that is the same for all markets. We have challenges in terms of naming, and we have tried to have unification. And we have a high expectation that this will be reached in a very near future. The alignment of requirements and documents for different markets. This is an activity that happens inside the RPS working group of IMDRF. So we have worked for aligning the documents that are demanded by other regulators. And so far, until we have this medical device single review program, which is a program in which the organizations that review and analyze regulations would be able to provide analysis for several markets that are participating. And finally, the reliance mechanisms. Anvisa has worked a lot in the reliance aspect over the past years, especially after the pandemic. This is a legacy the pandemic leaves, as Carlos and José Márcio mentioned, because these are situations that made Anvisa act differently and address regulation of some emergency products differently. So we prioritize some aspects, products related to the pandemic, registration of strategic medical devices based on other regulations that were carried out by countries that are part of the IMDRF. We had extraordinary imports of some kinds of products to face the pandemic, and the remote inspection, since the inspectors couldn't travel. So there was a difficulty of traveling and to make the inspections, and the reduction of the time of access to the market. This was our goal. So we wanted to allow regulated products to get to the market and be used by the population as soon as possible. Finally, we had the publication of a regulation, RDC 741 of 2022, that brings the general criteria to carry out the analysis of an equivalent foreigner regulating authority. So the analysis of a variety of products by Anvisa can be used by products in Brazil. And the idea of the medical device area is to establish a normative instruction that allows this mechanism to be used in the Brazilian market as well. So these were the general ideas I would like to share. I would like to thank everyone that is keeping up with this forum, thank the organization, and I'm available for any questions. Thank you, Augusto. It is very good to hear everything you are saying. Our expectations that the regulatory convergence together with a more demanding post-market and vigilance to help us to be quicker when the products enter the country. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Marcos Oliveira to talk a little about all of this we are discussing inside Inmetro. So the floor is yours, Marcos. Thank you, José Márcio. Good morning. First off, let me thank José Márcio and Carlos and Bruno and ABIIS especially for the invitation to be here with you and to be able to share a little of our experience in the subject when we talk about regulatory convergence. Who is on this path for some years, and I can say many years, I have participated of meetings of regulatory convergence, not necessarily in the health area, but different segments for at least 20 years. My friend Steve and I have been in different meetings, especially in the US, to debate this topic, which is so important, so relevant. And to be very honest, over these 20 years, we haven't advanced a lot in terms of regulatory convergence in all segments. So I see this effort from ABIIS and the Strategic Alliance for our region as an important fact, and I believe in it. Recently, we've been in Los Angeles, and I really believe that all the initiative, all the work that you are building will bring a product ahead. I'm sure of that. The challenge is huge. We will have a lot of work ahead of us, but I think it's all very important. And I would also like to support what José Márcio said in the beginning, and with Dr. Daniele and Augusto, with whom I started working at VISA in 1999 when it was created. And I'm very glad, first as a professional in the area, and secondly as a citizen, with the advances that Anvisa had, not only in terms of the pandemic, but over the years, Anvisa was becoming more professionalized and gaining market and gaining space. Dr. Daniela made a very interesting comment that as a public body, we know the financial resources and human resources are scarce, but the challenge is even bigger, and we have to bring all the discussion that we are having today. In the opening of our meeting, Carlos, Doutora Daniele, and our Congresswoman, Dr. Adriana, mentioned some words, and I'd like to bring those words. And our Congresswoman asked some question like, how can the Congress help in this important topic in the health scenario? How can we address innovation? How can we make this change we are seeing? We are talking about a change. We are talking about transformation. We talk a lot about the Industry 4.0. So how can we be inserted in this huge transformation that the world is experiencing? And I would like to ask another question that was not asked so far. So how can we add value? How can we have trust? How, as citizens, can we trust when we buy a digital stethoscope or whatever medical device? How can we have the trust that by purchasing this product, it will be reliable and we can believe that is good? And that is where Inmetro acts in Brazil, because the main product of Inmetro is to add trust to the products, processes, and services that are developed or regulated by different entities. Inmetro as I mentioned, has a partnership with Anvisa of many years, and many of these medical devices go through this system where Inmetro is the manager. So in this sense, I believe it's important to highlight the transformation that Inmetro has developed over the past 2.5 years with the President Marcos Heleno that we started into February 2020. We started with a project of transformation of the system in which Inmetro is part of. And we have this figure, this UN that brings the government system that we bring quality infrastructure. I'm not here saying the concept, but what I want to summarize is that it is a set of activities inserted with the society where we need to have, mainly if we look at the core of this graph, of this figure, this picture, two words that have to do with what we're discussing here.
It's the governance of this system and the regulatory mark. In this sense, we have started building since 2020, and it was published in February of this year. This legislation, the president of the country is part of the publication of an Inmetro regulation where we create the regulatory mark for this system. So we have published this regulatory mark, and now we are concluding the second important pillar of this big system. That's a policy, a national policy of infrastructure of quality. Until the end of the year, we may have a law by the president establishing this policy. That's not an Inmetro policy, it's a policy for the country. It's a state policy, so we can have this system that will be providing agility, it will provide credibility, it will provide for the society of the point of view as citizen or the point of view of the legal area. So this is a scenario that I would like to bring here so we could understand how we are proposing to create this transformation. And we have done this script in 2.5 years. We have started the rescue of a planning, strategical planning of Inmetro, where we were almost 10 years without having a direction where we want to go. And especially, we are the third decade of the 21st century, and that this project of transformation, it will include all these concepts that we're calling Inmetro 4.0, that it will be inserted in this context, in this national context and international context, so we can bring the best practice, the regulatory best practice, so we can build the regulatory convergency. What was mentioned here in the opening session, it's really difficult to harmonize, and I've been participating in so many meetings of technical point of views. It's really difficult to get some harmony of a technical regulation. It's for health or security or in oil, telecommunication. It's really difficult because there are some characteristics that are established for each country. But it was also mentioned here, and I think that this is the path about the convergency. It's not saying that the Brazilian regulation of health, of telecommunication, of energy, it needs to be exactly the same as another regulation from another country. I think that to be able to have that is going to take a while. So what's the path that we can have? To make available all this structure where I have the labs that are in Brazil or outside Brazil. As Augusto mentioned, right now, I was really pleased And we are doing that. We have remote assessments. Given what we had in the pandemic, we increased the use of this tool. So we from Inmetro, we are doing this. The entire world is using this assumption, all these alignments of the point of view, trying to get the best practice in regulation. In my opinion, it's fundamental so we can achieve the main goal, that is to have the regulatory convergency. And I think this structure of quality, this base, so we can add value, add trust, is one of the paths so we can have this convergency and the acceptance of a certified can be issued in Brazil and can be accepted in United States. Sandra brought an interesting approach where we have Brazil, Colombia, Peru, United States. Recently, I was in Guatemala last week. We have talked to people from Colombia and Mexico. We didn't talk to Peru, but we have talked to people from Colombia and Mexico. And we're going to work a lot in two actions that Marcio mentioned. The post-market, how we can build this post-market that's strong and that it's reliable. We're talking about this, but we don't have a product that we can have the trust that that post-market is going to ensure the credibility. So we are working with Mexico. We had a meeting last week, and with Colombia specifically, to move forward, at least in these three countries, in the point of view of post-market. So I think this is an important issue. And I'd like to close my presentation with another information for those who followed these 2 years of Inmetro. We have approved the framework, the regulatory framework of Inmetro. In the beginning of August, we have published the 286 agreement that we have the committee that will be implementing this regulatory model that was approved in February of this year in the next 5 years. We are receiving a lot of demands for that for pilot projects. And it's quite interesting because this committee has more private sector than governmental sector. So we are in this, we have CNE, CNA, CNS, CNC. We have the ABNT, that's an important branch for this system. We have representatives for the certification, BRAC, we have SEBRAE. So in this committee, we have more private sector than the governmental sector. So we can establish these rules throughout these 5 years with the implementation of this regulatory model. I know that we're going to have questions here, but I would like to start with a question. How the private sector can help in a better way for the governmental authorities to move forward in the actions for the regulatory best practices. So let's open to debate, but I would say to bring the productive sector to the project, to be part of the project, to bring the productive sector to build any best practice that we can build, because without the productive sector being part of creating this, I think that's going to be really difficult. So it was said here by my friends that have talked, that's important that the productive sector is part of that. Because we, as regulators, we don't know what is happening there in the road. We don't know what is happening on the other side. So the productive sector, they know what's happening. So again, thank you all for participating, and I'm here if you have any questions. Thank you, Marcio. Thank you. This session was really nice about what we have discussed. A suggestion that I would give for all the regulators is to keep an open door for communication. because for a long time it was really difficult to have access to the regulators, to have a constructive discussion. So now everyone is talking to one another, and this is quite interesting because sometimes the regulation has a good intention, but sometimes it's not considering the real life, the real world. And now with this process that we had for best regulatory practice, public consultancy, it was improving that. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So we have great questions here, but unfortunately, we don't have time. My promise is to send the question to them, to Sandra Augusto and Marcos, and then they can answer. I asked the people that asked the questions and didn't have the answer that you leave your contact in the chat so we can reply to the questions. So thank you all for participating here. It's an honor to be here in this session. I hope that we can meet in other discussions, and thank you very much. Yes, we thank you all, the people that were participating in this first session that started the discussions of this day. We'd like to thank those who built the questions, who sent the questions. The questions will be answered in the best way possible. They were not answered here, but for sure you are going to receive your answer. So we're going to have the second session, the session 2. The topic for this, the good practice, regulatory good practice and international trade. This is what we're going to guide this second discussion. So I would like to invite to come to the stage, please, Mr. Yoshihiro Lima Nemoto, please. He's the General Regulation Coordinator in the Economic Oversight Department. Welcome. And also invite Ms. Daniela Ferreira de Matos. Please, she is the Deputy Foreign Trade Secretary. I would like to invite you to the stage Ms. Renata Amaral, please, Head of Good Regulatory Practices of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergency for the Medical Technology Sector. So, and to moderate this session, we would like to invite Mr. Bruno Boldrin. Please welcome to the stage. To lead this session, Bruno is the Vice President of ABIIS, and he will moderate the activities for the session. So, Bruno, please be my guest.
Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Daniela, Renata, and Yoshihiro, my friends here in this panel. I would like to thank, first of all, Carlos Gouveia, José Márcio, too, for creating this event. I would like to say that it's an honor to be here, to have you here in our session. So thank you very much for your time and being available to be here, and thank the audience that are here with us. And in this panel, we'll talk specifically about the good regulatory practice and how this relates to the international trade. I'm not going to introduce our guests. They are amazing people in this topic, so we're going to go directly to this so we can have a good discussion in this panel. And ABIIS is working with this in this good regulatory practice in international trade since the beginning, since the foundation in 2011, working for smart regulation to enhance the institution of regulations for an improvement of the business environment of Brazil. And part of these strategic pillars goes through improving the international trade, as Dr. Augusto from the health product mentioned. The trade in this is really important for Brazil with other countries, and the good practice topic comes to boost this commerce and also to unlock this and to help the sector to be integrated, especially the ones that we have here in Brazil, to be better integrated in these chains. So for this discussion, I would like to start with the questions, one for each one of the speaker. They are going to have their presentation. I will receive the questions. If we have time, we can ask the questions. So I will start with Renata Amaral. Thank you for being here. Renata, that's doing an amazing job in the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergency. That's something that ABIIS integrates and supports. And Renata has a great background in international trade. So Renata, please, I would like you to talk a little bit how the pandemic brought these discussions, how the pandemic boosted these discussions in the entire world about the international trade, and for the medical device in the core of this discussion. In the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen how many countries were depending on another and how the production and the trade, the local production in few countries, how this is important to face pandemics. How this commercial dispute between the countries we have seen, United States and China especially, but the pandemic brought this boost of discussion of saying, I will bring my industry to my country, or I will bring the industry to the countries that are aligned with me, so I have a greater resiliency. How this discussion is happening, how this affects our sector, how much the countries are using of barriers that we don't have fees. We discussed this. We had that commercial disputes that were more classic related to fees, and now the countries have more technical barriers and not related to the fees, so they can protect themselves or to use the strategy in the trade. So how these barriers can affect this commerce, especially in our sector of medical device. And I'd like you to start commenting about the role of the coalition has in this discussion in the countries in the American continent with the regulators and the governments of the countries in the region. And then I have a question for Danielle about this, and then for Yoshihiro. And in the end, we'll answer the questions of the audience. So Renata, it's up to you.
Bom dia, agora tá. Obrigada, Bruno. É prazer.
Thank you, Bruno. It's a pleasure to be here with you in this panel with Daniela and Yoshihiro. I will answer your questions so we can start our discussion, but I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation so we can see what Daniela and Yoshihiro are going to comment about they are doing in the government environment about this topic. One of my main missions in the coalition is to bring the good regulatory practice and international trade for the same place, for the same room. As you have mentioned, I think that our coalition was founded 1 month before the world closing. In February of 2020, we have launched informally this coalition in Geneva in the International World Trade about the technical barriers to this trade, and 1 month later, the pandemic closed the entire world, and the sector had some evidence because of commercial barriers about restrictions to importing masks, ventilators. So all products of a number of products, of a range of products that are part of the medical devices. So as you have mentioned, through history after the Second World War, when the WHO started with the tariffs agreements, we had the barriers for that were the biggest problems for international trade. A few decades later, one of the main products are the barriers that are not related to the fees, the technical barriers. And I think that a pandemic made this in evidence for our sector, for medical device. So we have seen restrictions to exporting, creating certifications, labeling that were not necessary a lot of times because we have international standards that can be applied for the same product or for the same productive process. And then it created restrictions to import and export the products, or it was too expensive. So the pandemic, in a way or another, made this in evidence. And the sector, I think, that had a fundamental role in the discussions, not only in Latin America, but around the world about this topic. Of course, the coalition is focused here in this hemisphere. So we have 4 countries that will talk at the end of my presentation that are part now of the funding of the American government, the private sector, and that receive a greater attention that we have for the coalition for the convergence products for regulation in a horizontal way, not only for the medical device, this is the part that I'm the leader, but in a transversal way for other sectors. That's why we have regular discussions with Metro. We have heard Metro representative, Visa, CI, CSEC, that are the main parts of our sector for this topic. So I will have a short presentation so we can warm up this panel.
Como eu estava falando, ela tem essa
As I
preocupação.
mentioned, the coalition has this concern, and my role is to talk about the need of observe international standards when they exist. This is something that is part of the agreement of technical barriers to the commerce, and Brazil is a founding member. And so our vision is to have one standard, one test that is accepted everywhere to whatever scope of medical technology. Our mission is to promote the regulatory cooperation in all the Western Hemisphere to reach these regulations that are internationally aligned and to assess conformity in a continuous convergence process to maximize patients' access to high-quality medical technologies. We have to bear in mind that ultimately we are talking about patients with needs, we are talking about health. So it is a sensible and important sector, especially now in the context of the pandemic, but we believe that the pandemic served as to put the topics that we address in medical device on the spotlight. As Carlos mentioned in the opening, it was mixed with the discussion of medication and pharma, and I believe it gained the relevance it deserves in the past years, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. And when we talk about good regulatory practices and medical device, the sector all over the world believes that the governments can promote the economic growth and the well-being of the society through a design of regulatory, high-quality regulatory policies. We're not talking about creating new regulations, but rather an internal coordination and improvement of the internal processes. And I think in this case, it's important to have that. The quality regulatory policy is about all that, and that is where we start our conversation. When we talk about processes, systems, tools, and methods that are internationally recognized, always talking about international standards when they exist, to ensure the quality, transparency, and development of regulations. Good regulatory practices, when we talk about it, I'm not going to talk about all the elements, but the key elements of a good regulatory practice include the engagement of the stakeholders, and in this umbrella, the public consultation is a good example of what would be the engagement of the stakeholders, the trust in quality data and solid science to introduce new regulations, impact analysis of the proposed regulation, imposed and exposed, the use of international standards, and the measures of transparency like a regulatory agenda. When we talk of good regulatory practices in international trade, and Daniela can talk even better about that because CSEX is a part of this intersection. We are talking about what we mentioned in the beginning of this conversation. Today, we see an unnecessary creation of regulations, standards, certifications, labeling, requirements, and often they are unnecessary because there is an international standard most of the times, and there is the creation. In many countries, we see that, especially in Latin America, the unnecessary creation of regulations that create a necessary regulatory inconvergence, and then we do that a lot. We have to think and rethink on how to present that to some institutions to explain what the country does and all that, but we don't need if we have a standard, an international standard that can be served. And so we end up having divergence, and so we end up discussing this topic. If we have regulatory divergence that creates restriction to commerce, it affects productive chains, and for the sector of medical device, it's extremely important because the supply chain is very long, it's diversified. We address several different products that may have changes and innovations, and it happens very often. So if everyone creates different regulations, different standards and labelings and namings in a sector like the medical device, we interrupt the process of supply chain in many links, not only one. Considering the amount of countries that are involved in most sophisticated products, the most sophisticated equipment. So here are just some examples of medical devices, and leave a message because a delay in the medical supply chain is not just a commercial barrier and a burden to manufacturers or the interruption of the global supply chain, because here we are talking at the end of the day of patients that don't have access to equipment, to device that are essential for treating an illness. And we don't think about it, of course. I know the other sectors are important for the economy, but the sector of medical device is about health and about patients that in many cases need a valve or a respirator and they don't have access to it, and it may cost a life. Very quickly about good regulatory practice in international trade, the intersection is the TBT, the technical barrier trade, and we are part of it. So we have to follow the agreements of the organization. One of them is the technical barriers to trade, and one of the focal points here in Brazil is in Metro. So you had Marcos mentioning a little bit about it. And the TBT and the committee, which is where we launched coalition in 2021, there is a single discussion for regulation, for harmonization, or at least the convergence of regulatory standards. This is an important forum, and I pay more attention to this forum, but we have the WHO, and we try to bring everyone for our workshops for the same space to discuss. And medical device in Brazil, not because we are in Brazil, but and because Anvisa just mentioned, but Anvisa is a model for all the other countries in the region, and inside coalition, inside the work we do, it is our benchmark to the rest of the region. Most of the world countries, and especially in Latin America, the regulating agencies for medical devices have 1/10 of what FDA has in the US, with 2,000 employees. Of course, most of the countries don't have that structure to address regulatory in the health issues, and agencies end up not observing these international standards or not removing the barriers to trade, which affects the international trade. And this is a complication, and most of our efforts is to do that since 2020. And here is a process of Anvisa. It's a print screen of regulatory process that Anvisa has. And just to conclude, 2 slides to talk a little about the projects that Sandra mentioned in the previous panel. I lead the tier 1 of the project, which is the transversal part of the project that goes through medical devices, but also works for different sectors. Sandra leads tier 2, which is focused on medical devices. For countries that are contemplated, which is Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru. In tier 1, the level 1 is the implementation of good regulatory practices, and our goal is to update the reference guides and the implementation of good regulatory practices, analyze the good regulatory practice deficiencies, implement good regulatory practices bilaterally and in coordination with countries that objects matter to the project, and ideally regionally, and implement good regulatory practice in multilateral levels, observing standards that exist internationally. Some performance measures of the project is to align the regulatory structures for medical device, the technical regulation requirements, standards and conformity assessments, increase the regulatory efficiency, improving the efficiency of the medical device agencies. And finally, what we have done in Brazil, as Sandra mentioned a little bit in the beginning, we have been closely aligned to INMetro, SEIA, and STSEX, and the idea is to understand how we can contribute to the Brazilian processes with funding, as we have in the project, but also taking the Brazilian models to other countries that are part of the project. So this is what the coalition does. It's been surprising for me. I wasn't part of the sector, and I think it's amazing to see what the coalition does. The pandemic, unfortunately, was our moment in the humanity was very complicated, but it was a moment of learning for this sector because of the importance it received. So it's a relevant work we have carried out in the Western Hemisphere and in other regions of the planet we have interacted with. Excellent, Renata. You were great by tying so many topics and preparing the ground for our next speakers. We heard from Renata the perspective from the side of the coalition, and I believe that having witnessed the work the coalition does in the past 2 years, a little more than 2 years, it's too little time for the amount of things the coalition did and the amount of results we have seen. So it's an amazing work. And now I'm here with Daniela, who is the Deputy Foreign Trade Secretary of the Ministry of Economy. So thank you, Daniela, for being here. And I would like to roll the ball to you by catching something Renata mentioned. She said that good regulatory practices and international trade get together in the same room. And of course, the Brazilian government, since Brazil in the medical device market of Latin America, it's its largest, most important market in terms of trade and financial move, and it's very relevant. So what is the role of CSEX in coordinating these topics, the relation between good practices and trade internationally and nationally, and what actions has CSEX carried out in this agenda to go forward with these topics, not only to benefit the medical device sector, but other sectors of the economy? Thank you, Bruno. Renata, and Yoshihiro. It is a pleasure to be here and talk about such a relevant topic and so dear to the Foreign Trade Secretary. And I believe the beginning of the question was about how good regulatory practices and foreign trade, international trade relate. So good practices are key to the business environment, and foreign trade needs a business environment that provides room for innovation and possibility of entrepreneurship. So the good practices help with that, with transparency, with a rational decision-making process and predictability for the private sector to carry out their businesses. It generates more investment in the country and increases the commerce. That's why it's so important for the Secretary of Foreign Trade. We know this is important, but how important it is? I'm an economist, and I'm a Secretary of Foreign Trade, and we have a quantitative catch, but the estimation of the Economy Ministry for Business and Jobs that say that the regulatory inefficiency of public administration is 13% of the Brazilian cost, which would be between 160 and 200 billion reais a year, costing more to the private sector, the ones trying to entrepreneur in Brazil. And that would be equivalent to the tariff protection cost of Brazil. It was estimated in 181 billion reais approximately. And so Brazil has a high tariff protection. And this is something we have done. There are efforts to decrease the imports taxes in Brazil, but there are other ways to improve and make it easier to carry out commerce and the private sector in Brazil. And what is the problem of all that? One thing is to reduce one tariff. Of course, it's not easy, but when you're talking about regulatory matters and you're talking about from the border in, and so we can facilitate the effort in the border, but also from the border in, which is the regulatory aspect. And then there is a complexity level much higher. So what has been done so far? I think Yoshihiro and has a great work. And this is the umbrella that helps us going forward. So first is the law of the regulatory agencies, the law of economic freedom that was essential for this whole process, with the 4 regulating decrees of this law. There's one that talks about public act of liberation, and we're talking about licensing for imports, a decree about updated standards, one about regulatory impact analysis. So all those decrees were very important for us to implement this agenda that has been implemented. And finally, we have in this huge umbrella the business environment law. And internationally, what we have done so far, we've had this effectiveness of the commercial rules and transparency protocol between Brazil and the US. I think this was a framework in our good regulatory practices. The protocol has some attachments, and one of them is good regulatory practices and has all the points that Renata highlighted in terms of public consultation, regulatory impact analysis, predictability, and it's mandatory to have an agenda of the people that are closer to the regulation. And so we negotiate the agreement, it is effective, and now it's the part of the implementation. Recently, in June, in Los Angeles, we signed between Brazil and US and other 14 countries the Declaration of Good Regulatory Practice in the Summit of the Americas. This is another framework, another landmark saying that we are trying to implement it internally. So let's try other markets now in promoting good regulatory practice for other markets, other commercial partners. Brazil also is following the OECD peer review recommendations, and I think you can talk more about that. And Brazil has negotiated and is now concluding the negotiations of an agreement for services with the World Commerce Organization. So service providers have the same points of public consultation, transparency, and facility to provide their services.
Aqui eu vou passar rápido, a gente já passou bastante aqui sobre o que é o anexo de boas
Here I'm
práticas.
going to go very quickly with the good regulatory practices between Brazil and the US and what is the initiatives of the regulatory impact. And so this is a hybrid role because in C6 we are negotiators. We have the subsecretary of negotiation, and so we have the role of negotiating and not only negotiating agreements and then boost the agenda of a domestic aspects, but also using the good regulatory practices with partners and having the role of regulator. CSEX is a regulator. We have decrees, we have the Commercial Defense Secretary, we have licensing for exports. So these are good regulatory practices in its regulations, and we also have the role of coordinator in the presidence of commerce facilitation, which is the moment we get in contact with other parts of the government to promote good regulatory practices.
Bem amplo como secretária
So I
de
think we have a wide range of our role in promoting good practice. So here just some more recent initiatives we have published. The Inner Book, it's our commitment with transparency about everything that's being done. We have the pact analysis for commercial agreement and for all regulations of CSEX that has a important and are relevant. We have promoted last year review and a consolidation of all the rules of the CSEX. We are still a few things missing, but we are moving forward a lot. And what I'm mentioning, that's promoting good regulatory practice to the surveillance bodies in the international trade. It's hard, it takes some time, but I think that's something quite relevant. And it's really important to have this view that everyone needs to do your part. So what are the next steps? We want to publish the good regulatory practice. It was an initiative from CI and CSEX. We participated on that, but this rule will implement all the commitments that we have with the American people. We want to publish the rule about the importing license. So it's hard to estimate when they will be published, but I would say that soon, especially about the license for importing. So we are waiting the day that will be launched. This law about it's to apply the good practice in importing. So the body wants to have a license for importing. So we have the analysis, we have a public consultation, we justify why you need this license. I think that's part of trying to intervene the least as possible in the trade. Of course, we need to have the license when it's necessary, but when it's not necessary, you can try to get other ways of getting the information or whatever that the body is looking for. So we have this agenda that we are looking more now, that's to promote the good regulatory practice in America. So we have checking with the other countries. We want to update our rules and our agreements for good regulatory practice in the countries in Mercosur. So it's an idea to have a chapter about this in our agreement with Peru. And also to include chapters about regulatory practice in any new agreements, commercial agreements that we may have. And here, just to close the presentation, to talk a little bit how I think that all of this that we're talking here retrofeeds. We couldn't negotiate all these commitments and to promote this in partner countries if we didn't have the implementation in our own country that's being done amazingly by CI. And at the same time, I think that CI retrofeeds from everything that we've been doing, the commitments that we are being part of, and bringing this debate to the discussions. I think this is what I would like to say so far. So if we have other discussions, I can answer some questions. Thank you, Daniela. As you were able to see through Daniela's presentation, the SESEX and CI, the Brazilian government, through the Ministry of Economy and the secretaries, is doing an effort in this area of tackling the internal fees that we have, that are the barriers and so on, because it's so complex and sometimes not easy for the trade. And Daniela especially is a spokesperson for this agenda. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of ABIIS for all the support that you personally provide to this agenda and SESEX as a whole. So it's a really strong work. And I think that we should mention that this work not only benefits our area of medical device, it benefits the entire country, different sectors of economy. In our case, we are working in this collaboration because the sector, as Renata mentioned, it became so important. It was important, but now it's in more evidence because of the pandemic. So certainly it was an opportunity to move forward in this discussion. So now, Yoshihiro, to get more details, how Daniela mentioned about this implementation, this domestic implementation, that the CI is being part of the good practice agenda in Brazil. I'd like to understand what are the CI actions. So getting into details about the macro topics that Daniela mentioned, and how is this discussion of good practice about the trade and the work of Brazil about the OCDE. We know that to Brazil to be part of that, we need to fulfill a number of commitments. How is that? Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. Good morning, Daniela, Renata. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Economic Oversight Department, our secretariat. And my mission here is to tell you about the last actions that we are developing in improving or speed up and continue the good regulatory practice in Brazil. So we start with a short history, 2007 until 2018. It was the beginning of this path through the first initiatives. In 2019, we had an important law of regulatory agencies, the Economic Freedom Act. So I'll not talk too much about this, because the good part of talking last is because we can benefit about everything that was said. So focusing on the good regulatory practice to contributing to Brazil as a member of OCDE, we had an overview of this regulation in Brazil, and we had recommendations about regulatory governance. We had the policy institutions, we have the regulatory stock review, we have an assessment, and the subnational levels of regulation. So the challenge first is to reply this, the development, the growth of regulations that Brazil is facing in these last 10, 20 years. One of the actions that CI is doing to address these recommendations is to understand what is our overview based on evidence. First, the obvious work is to identify who are the federal regulators. So when we talk about federal regulators, we think about the agencies, not just that. As Daniela said, different bodies have to establish the technical reviews. They are regulators. If they have this responsibility, it needs to be based on evidence and a good regulatory practice, to use the analysis to foresee some things related to these interventions, to have the dialogues with the stakeholders to improve, and always get the best of this for the regulation process. And this participation brings legitimacy to this act. When you're part of creating that rule, your possibility, your acceptance of this rule is greater. So in these 107 regulators, one of the actions is to have this regulator feeling. So we want to understand how these regulators are working and what is the level to the adherence to the good regulatory practice, and we want to have this in a higher level. Everyone that's doing a great job regarding the agencies, they can take a step forward. Who's beginning can see this as a role model to have a positive reference. So we see that in these different views, the majority of regulators, they have some type of procedures, more than 90%, and more than 40%, they issue some license or permission. So in this view of parameters, of barriers that are not related to fees, we have this type of limitations. One of the concrete actions that the CI have done in the last times, in 1 month, we have a rating system to recognize these good regulatory practices in 5 different topics, following the recommendation of CDE, is to have this convergency. We see that one of the points here, it was mentioned here before about the regulatory convergence. So we have the feasibility, regulatory quality, the public participation, the convergence, and regulatory burden. So we have 10 requirements, goals that CI assess in their acts, and we can see with that, with these requirements, if there was social participation, if that was foreseen a regulatory agenda, so the participants could contribute in a qualified way in the public consultation, also verifying some other aspects about competition. CI has an important role in this. The quantitative analysis too. So if we're going to intervene in the market and we see that every time it has some relation to economic development, so it's a recommendation to the regulators somehow to estimate these impacts. It's not that something definitive, but it should be explored in the health area for sure. Time, not only money, it means that we're talking about lives. So we need to take into consideration this quantitative aspects. So moving forward in the requirements, other actions that we have in CI to disseminate the good regulatory practice, to analyze that, growing this culture that before doing something, we need to have a clear scenario of what are the fulfillments of having the right choice. What is the set of regulations that will address the problem? That should be well identified. The cause and effect ratio should be well defined. CI is doing this work about elaborating guidelines to facilitate and make available tools for quantitative measure to promote events, to get the federal regulators closer, and to have this exchange of experience. And besides that, as Daniela mentioned, about this protocol, Brazil, United States, recently, CI launched our stakeholder guide for those regulators that are not used to the benefits of this participation, so they can understand how they can be engaged and not only have a public consultation. You need to listen and give the possibility for the agents to contribute It's a positive dialogue. Following this path of creating a greater dialogue with the stakeholders, we have the 107 federal regulators. So we are working to promote these discussions with these committees, that we have regulatory agencies and the direct administration body. So discuss this good practice. It's not only the regulatory agents that are in this position, they're more engaged. We have seen earlier in Metro, CSEX, they are quite engaged. We have the Agriculture Ministry examples that are engaged in the improvements in regulation. So since this diagnosis of the peer review of the OCDE, from this diagnosis, we have 17 deliveries addressing these recommendations. I've brought some of them here, so I wouldn't take so much time. And the last is one to disseminate in the states, in the municipalities, these good regulatory practices. What can be a benefit for this capillarity that we have between states and municipalities of representing this agenda for improvement in regulatory practice and remove technical barriers, especially the technical barriers. Brazil is a country with a lot of bureaucracy. We have 160 and 200 billion reais in the cost of not being in a regulatory environment. How would I give an adjective to be in a health environment? But the cost for that in Brazil is higher. It represents 13%, 1.5 trillion reais per year. So what CI can contribute in this recognition of the regulatory burden? I think that the first action is to recognize the impact of this non-efficiency. And the second step is to try to reduce this inefficiency. So this quantitative approach, it's important so the regulator can identify the priorities and address this the best way possible. So we want to prioritize this approach in a more objective way to avoid other bias. So that's it. That's what I want to talk briefly in these minutes so we don't have a delay. So we are available for questions. And the goal of CI is to contribute and have this good regulatory practice and to reduce barriers and inefficiencies that stop Brazil of being in a better position in the international trade. In this sector of medical device. So there's nothing that cannot be improved. So with more economical freedom, with more innovation, and more jobs and profitability. So we want Brazil to be in this position internationally. Thank you very much. Yoshihiro, thank you very much. We have 3 minutes. So I'll take the freedom and the privilege of being a moderator of this panel to ask a question for Yoshihiro and Daniela. Yoshihiro brought 127 regulators in the federal environment, and that CI has the work to coordinate this agenda with all of them, the mappings that you have showed. And you mentioned some examples, the Ministry of Agriculture, we have Anvisa here, that's quite engaged since the past. It was a model agency in this topic. I would like to understand, Yoshihiro, how you see the level of engaging of each one of these regulators, not each one, but in a general overview, how you see the engaging level of these Brazilian regulators in this agenda. If there is an engaging, let's say that's disseminated, that everyone understands that this is good, what they need to do, or there are a lot of challenges. and the level of knowledge of each one of these regulators related to the topic. And the same question to Daniela, how she sees, and the Brazilian government has a role of negotiator and implementing this in this discussion with other countries, the same thing, how these other countries are engaged in this agenda, in their interest for this agenda, and also the level of knowledge. I know that are difficult questions. If you can give an answer indicating a path, we can go deeper with this debate in another opportunity. So please. Thank you, Bruno. Great question. What we have seen, the challenge of CI is to have this leveling, to check the level. Among them, they are in the denial phase, you know. They do everything that the regulator does, but they don't understand how they don't see themselves as regulators. So one of the challenges is to bring them and to show that they have this role, and so they need to direct their actions in a more evidence-based condition with more accountability, more social participation. And we have been using these good examples as lighthouses, as references. The rating system, so we want to show to the regulators, the federal regulators, that these regulatory agencies, this body of administration that are engaged in this agenda, they are being able to get this because they made the decision based in their regulations in the good regulatory practices. So it's much better to reduce this cost of learning. So we don't need to invent anything new. Before integrating CI, I had the privilege of helping internalizing this in creating a new regulatory agency. So as I've told them, we don't need to wait 20 years to be in a good step, in a good position that VII or older and more mature agencies are. We can have a shortcut, and that's it. That's the goal of CI, to use these good examples that were done already to convince and show to them, based on example, in a positive example, that we should invest in the good practice.
Bom, com relação a parceiros comerciais,
regarding commercial partners, it is pretty much the same perception in the sense that they are open. And I talk about the Latin America countries, the Mercosur partners, and it's a little about that matter. Like, explain a little more about it. You have the commercial dialogue with the American partners that CISEX has with the Commerce Department. And we had a roundtable last month, and we suggested, can we invite some Latin America partners for some of these presentations and some of those webinars? Because the idea is to present good practices is a positive agenda, different from reducing tariff and reducing access to the market. It's a positive agenda. It's hardworking. People mention at CSX that it is a really heavy food kind of agenda, but the countries are open, and it's just a matter of a time of implementation. But I'm very optimistic with the idea of expanding good practices for the region. I'm glad our countries, neighbor countries, are willing to work with us on this hard work. And so I would like to thank again Yoshihiro, Daniela, and Renata for the participation in this panel. Congratulate them for the work. And now call the master of ceremony and thank for the audience and the questions that we weren't able to respond. We are going to forward the answer in writing for you afterwards. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno, and I thank you for leading this round of discussion number 2, and I invite you all to take your seats in the audience. And now this was table 2. We will have our president and then table 3 to conclude the day. So let me invite now Mr. Carlos Eduardo Gouveia, the President of the Board of Administration of ABIIS, back to a presentation that is proposals for developing an industrial park of medical devices. So please, Mr. President, would you please take the stage? The floor is yours. Thank you. I hope you are enjoying it because discussions have been excellent and very useful, and they will generate a lot of work in the next months. So I would like to bring a little bit of this vision of ABIIS and the entities it comprises on the proposal that we have for the medical device industrial park, approaching it in a more complete way, the proposals that are developed and that are part of a great work. So you are clear, ABIIS is an alliance of several entities that comprise the medical device and diagnosis sectors, and we highlight ABRAID, ADVAMED, and CBDL, which is the Brazilian Chamber of Laboratorial Devices. And since 2011, it's existed, and it has shown a space that the health products should and must occupy not only the lives of the citizen, the patient, but also in the environment that creates the healthcare laws. The pharma area is confused with medical devices, and it brings huge problems to us because when it's time to discuss the bad part, we are together, but the good part, they forget about the sector. So it has always been a problem, and because people don't know it so well. That's why since then, we've had the intention, and we were successful in some aspects, of producing documents and a positive advocacy and a well-structured work to show the role. And for 2022-23, we are looking for producing economic data of our sector, bringing index that can be followed by all sectors, boost the implementation of good regulatory practices, as mentioned here today, work to improve the technology incorporation policies for our sector without discussing other actions that are key, like the tributary reform, the resilience of the production global chains, and cooperating, as you see, with national and international agencies to diffuse the qualified information about the segment. A good example is the economic report, and we have the new edition that was just published and will be available at ABIIS website for you. From here, you can follow economic data from the market that show from the apparent consumption per sector over the year, like import, production, employment, in a qualified level and well produced by the consultancy that provides us, which is called Web Setorial. The data can and will help lots of people to develop policies and discussions by giving qualified information that are obtained based on public database with MCM and KNI filters for our segments. And so industry, distributors and importers are working inside this productive chain with all the other stakeholders to carry out concrete proposals, and we are not about few, it's more than 15,000 companies dedicated in the segment in the different parts of this value chain. The sector as a whole represents over $11 billion, 140,000 direct employees, and indirect 250 with 80,000 projects registered in the visa, and the workforce is highly qualified. It needs preparation, it needs to count for an important academia for providing this support for their knowledge and the development of certain innovations and actions in the country, and a superior average salary because of this specialization. And this is important for the economy in Brazil. And we like to show that medical devices are actually in all of our phases of our lives, from cradle to grave. Actually, we've always have a device working with us for prevention, for monitoring, or treatment of an individual. And in which situations? From the control of the hospital infection until in extremely personalized way. The personalized medicine is a reality today. Diagnosis can say what therapy will be more effective for that patient in oncology, for example. And so that specific mutation can not be the best one for that specific treatment. So the monitoring all that is essential. And among all the other possibilities, we highlight, for instance, eye health. So the e-health, I'm sorry. So it's either with a software as a medical device or supporting the interoperability and the integration of data. And then in this line of pillars, we have the rational incorporation, as we mentioned, smart regulation, support to regulators, and among others, without forgetting ethics and compliance. And we are part of the Ethics and Health Institute, which is the most example of high regulation inside the value chain of health in the world, maybe, bringing industry, distributors, and importers, and medical society, patients, operators, among so many other stakeholders. Inside this universe, what ABIIS wants to do by having concrete pillars in our minds, in our actions, we look for the future. And the future is extremely fluid, more and more. It gets changing. So if we don't monitor it properly, you get obsolete. And that's the reality we have to consider. The life cycle of the medical device is from 2 to 3 years. It's much more of incremental innovation than disruptive innovation, so it's important to keep up. Why? Because what used to be fiction in the past today is a reality. And who doesn't remember Dr. Spock in Star Trek? It was science fiction. Now it's not anymore. The wearables are amazing examples of this evolution that is so quick. In diagnosis, we talk and think about diagnosis not so modern, but remember the huge equipment that was integrated, like machines of diagnosis. It is a reality, but sometimes a small point of data, one device has such a high technology that it can provide an early and precise information for those who don't have access to a health facility in their surroundings. And that's when we get to the topic of the invisible citizen, that we have to look for them, to go to where they are with a simple solution that can be a simple test or a molecular biology point of care technology, and we have so many of them. In this universe, the integration with data is key because the smartphone today enables you to have this exchange of data with your healthcare professional, and you have the possibility of having constant monitoring and integrate with public healthcare networks. The epidemiologic vigilance was a part of a role of the state, but more and more we see the citizen as an active element in this situation. The pandemic brought those possibilities of you having data integration. All labs, if they have a positive for COVID, they had to integrate and give this information to the Ministry of Health. And we saw, for instance, with self-test, that it could be a situation for the patient to contribute as well. Until we find a model, it's going to take a while. But the fact is that this is part of the discussions, the integration for you to carry information, map the needs, and then make a decision and the right action. We talk a lot about the good regulatory practices, and in this discussion, it was mentioned, as Dr. Daniela mentioned, the Summit of Americas. The event was an event of many countries that got together to discuss not only the post-pandemic, but how we could evolve from the commitments that were assumed between 14 countries, and Brazil was represented by the Ministry of the Economy in its different secretaries. We brought several actions. All of them, in a way, would get into the topic of health. And we can highlight what they call localization, which is trying to mitigate the impact of the logistics disruption that we had. Suddenly we had no products coming from Asia, for instance, because planes were not flying, there was no ship, the production was not possible for the demand. And so we had to really look for alternatives. And we saw that we were alone. And not only Brazil, Latin America as a whole struggled with that. And from the commitments the Summit of Americas assumed, Brazil assumed the commitment of promoting health, not only post-pandemic, in terms of assistance to its population, especially for the chronic non-transmittable illnesses that were not monitored, and look for alternatives for production regionally or locally for certain strategic areas. And for that, you need a strong academia supporting innovation and preparation for all that. And finally, using all that as an element of support to establish commercial partnership with the near countries, which is called nearshoring, selling to the near countries and exchange commerce. The document is here. We have several commitments, but it's in this area, and this presentation will be available for you, and it's worth the while visiting it. Anyway, the proposals get into some items in some sectors. And so we have proposals for the rational use, the rational incorporation of technologies for ethics and compliance in smart regulation, and for the regulators' institutional enhancement. All of those were well thought, many were discussed already, and I would like to bring a summary of some points that, in my opinion, are relevant and prepare the grounds for the next panel. So the discussion of the health industrial complex in Brazil is key, and it was restarted this month by the Ministry of Health. And it was very important because for the ministry itself, it was clear that devices need discussion that is adequate and apart from medication. We don't have centralized purchase like medication do, and we don't have this spread knowledge in country, in the research, development, innovation centers, and in academy like we had for pharma. And the fact is that we need a new model, and then the associations, together with the Ministry of Health, were able to brainstorm and start a discussion for a new model. The fact is that we need a broader view, and that the private initiative can and must invest in new solutions together with the ministry, and not necessarily in the traditional model of a PDP, but a more open movement. And for that, we have the possibility of creating, as it will be done for CBDL, an observatory that will monitor the real use of products on the field with georeferencing to verify where the gaps are and how you can act more effectively to formulate public policies for that. That kind of observatory brings information not only about the real use and the development of proposals, but also help us see what solutions inside this context
cada vez mais sair da doença e passar, sim, para uma mudança de quê? De prevenção.
And so we have a change to prevention. Prevention is essential to change the whole aspect. Map the hubs of innovation that go for these medical devices with integrated network that is optimized. We see here today in Metro, and besides in Metro, we have TechPa, Biotech Town, Innovag HC, and so many others, any other entities and structures in the state of Paraíba, we are going to hear about it, that are working ahead, but often isolatedly. So wouldn't it be up to an entity like that help create the integration and cooperation? And the cooperation between the academia, the industry, and the government is essential to bring public health and integrate public health policies. And the idea of new models of production has been not only in the summit of the America, but in the main Congress of Clinical Analysis, where they discussed the trends, where the world's heading at, and this break of the logistic problem that was caused. And remember that it's not the first and will not be the last pandemic. We're going to have others. And are we ready? Maybe not. So inside this context, there was even this discussion that grows about how you can find regional or local options for alternatives for health.
Sustentabilidade, por fim,
The sustainability, the last slide, it's fundamental. It's necessary to reach this, to be something that can continue being innovative, to bring new things. And with that, we need to have a taxation model that can be the proper one. We will have the Senator Humberto Costa being part of the next session. And this is an interesting topic to everyone. The continuous discussion about the role of medical device, about incorporation, but also decorporation. We need to work in a consistent way and with the right remuneration to continue. We are a promoter of more efficient therapies, and the health sector should be taken into all discussions as the promoter of knowledge, as the promoter of education, and about economic cooperation in our region. So I bring here example of papers and works that are being done about the necessary criteria to nationalize part of the supply chain, because the future is in our hands and we can make a difference. This is what we hope for, and we count on all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, President, for your speech, bringing here your impressions and the proposals to develop the industrial park for medical device. Thank you for speech. And now we're going to start the third panel that's going to be related about this main topic, the development of the industrial park of medical device in Brazil. To integrate this last panel, I would like to invite Mr. Eduardo Oliveira, please. He is the professor in the Health-Related Strategic Technology Center from the UEPB. I would like to invite you to participate in this session, Ms. Fotini Toscas. She's a scientific researcher in the Health Technology Center for the Public Health Service in Brazil from São Paulo. She's in virtual mode. Welcome to our event. I would like to invite to take your seat here, the Senator Humberto Costa. Please, Mr. Senator, please take your seat. We also invite Mr. Ronaldo Luiz Pires, the Director for Governmental Affairs for Johnson & Johnson. Welcome. And also Mr. Alexandre Guimarães, the President and CEO from Lab Test Diagnostica SA, and Professor of the Fundação Dom Cabral and Strategic Management and Supply Chain. Welcome, all of you. I would like to invite to moderate this discussion. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Sérgio Rocha. So he is the director of ABIIS Board of Administration. Welcome, you all. Thank you all for being here. Have a good debate. So, Mr. Moderator, the floor is yours. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in an important panel like this. It's important for us from ABIIS, so thank you all for being here for this debate. My intention is to let you to talk about your thoughts about this topic, and I want to ask a question so it can be more dynamic and that people can use your knowledge. So to me, it's a satisfaction to be here in this session. I think that the issues that we are facing now about health, about the health industry in our country, this event today from ABIIS, it's an opportunity so we can discuss a little bit more, even a short period of time, a little bit more deep. We have online Dr. Fucini that's here with us. I don't know if she has some presentation. People are asking me if you have a presentation. I'd like to start with you as you are online. So if you have some presentation and you would like to show your presentation through your computer, or if you want to send to the technical team, so thank you for being with us. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Congratulations to the Brazilian Alliance for Innovative Health Industry. And I brought a presentation here, and I was listening to the colleagues. I think that I have brought some data so we can have the debate basically about the assessment and incorporation and adopting these devices by the public health system, and about the purchase process, refund of these technologies. So can you see my presentation? So I think that at first I will talk how we find data about the finance and refund of medical devices. We're going to see that we discussed in the first session, the first panel, the polarity that we have regarding the devices. We have different types of devices, and the health department, we are going to take into consideration the group of expenses. We're going to get the devices that are funded with some capital elements, and this, in some way, it's harder to be able to consolidate this data because they get fragmented. What are these perspectives? What are the points of improvements and the opportunities that we have, evaluation and incorporation of these devices in the public health system, and the need to discuss the database that will generate value, the data about the funding, about refund, about the price, the suitable price, and data that will support the evaluation process and incorporating these technologies. So in the National Fund of Health, we have some data about the funding. So these devices that are in the national list of devices and materials that are funded by the public health systems, we have some data in this panel saying what is the value that we have of moving this in the market, about availability, about these resources, where the institutions will do the math. So he mentioned the majority in the public health systems is purchased in a different way from the medicine. It's more spread and decentralized. So we have some specificities for this to gather these resources to have the budget for the acquisition process and installation. If we detail what we have, how these devices are being funded, we brought two data. The data about what are the devices that has the higher cost for the system, who are these elements that has this power to have the acquisition, high complexity equipment, so with a meaningful value for the system. And we've seen the accelerators, the MRI, the PET scan. So we have this value, a considerable value for investment. They have a high level complexity too. for installation, about infrastructure, about human resources. And we also brought here some data about what are devices that are more requested. And we see that in these systems, this funding system, the more requested devices are furniture, chairs, air conditioning, IT devices. So thinking about strategies according to the technological density, it's possible to fund everything the same way, considering that we have different cities, we have different complexities. And thinking about this gap of three equipments, we brought two data. We have brought two data about the accelerator, that's the equipment with the higher cost of acquisition for the system. It has a project for 10 years that's being executed, that the expansion plan for radiotherapy, there is a different modality. So it was a centralized purchase for the Ministry of Health. We had this compensation area, and we have some innovative modalities where associates not only the device, but the physical infrastructure and also the human resources. This project at first, because of the bargain power, we had 60% in that. And there are a lot of experiences thinking about these 10 years about this expansion plan of radiotherapy in the public health system, and was to identify the values that we had about the exchange rate. So we have this chart, the values that we had in the public health system, and considering that there was some exchange rate variation, and above we have the values that are funded by the National Fund of Health through the management system, and we can see what was the impact that the exchange rate had about the values, the decentralized values, and the centralized ones. Another data that's related to the PET scan, that we have the high cost for the system. And we have studied the PET CT. So throughout time, we have seen how was the incorporation of PET in the service. So in 2014, actually 2013, the Ministry of Health published this as a strategical device. So it was in 2014, was in the list. So Conitec agreed with that, so it was incorporated in the system for the carrying line for oncology and for tumors. And since 2014, we have seen what are the challenges to install these devices. After incorporating a high complexity technology, the funding, this model of funding, is it enough or not? So the institutions that need this device can do that, can gather the resources for that, and also install this with all the requirements that are necessary. And now with the colleagues for the Institute of Technology, they have a study, and we have 7 states in Brazil. After 8 years of incorporating technologies, we have 7 states that they don't have the PET installed. So we have this inequality in technology. So we have some states that they don't have this. And to think about this incorporation model, how this technology will be funded, or how we will think about the acquisition or make available, not only acquisition, but installation, and make this technology available in the health service. Another data would be about the expenses. That would be the cost, about the refunding this through tables or the system. So the health public system. So we have the 2 main groups. That's the prosthesis or thesis and special materials that are related to the surgical act, and the ones that are not related to surgery. So we can see a great challenge here, a big challenge in this table. That's how we can review, update. We have seen the discussions we have a dynamic about renewal that's really big in the medical device, about pricing, about the technical characteristics, and think how we can bring to this system these procedural tables in a model that we can update in a faster way with more agility to have the reviews, because it also has a meaningful impact for the economical department and health department. And some data about Conitec. So Conitec is now 11 years old. We have here some data about the demands that were assessed through reports of recommendation of products. It represents 11% of the demand of Conitec assessed. It's related to health products. Of that, we see that 45 had reports with decision, 4 are under analysis, and there's a number here that has a high potential opportunity. We have more than the assessment. We have 46 that are not in the agreement. So we have more demands that are not right than the ones that can be assessed to have a report. And I think this point of opportunity of thinking about the collaboration, how we can qualify this request in a more collaborative way with a lot of discussions, dialogues to reduce this. Because the interesting is to have the demands that are possible to be done. So we can go to the assessment process. I think that's an important point that we have in this system about qualifying the intricacy of the demand so we can make the subsidies to that about recommendation or not for that technology. There's another number that I would like to highlight here, that we have 23 that were closed according to request or because they were out of scope. We have seen the plurality that is the area for medical device. And Conitec, there is a defined scope of what are the medical devices that are there for the demand that can be analyzed by Conitec. And the question is, from the ones that are out of Conitec, what happened to them? So we have the ones that are not part of the scope of Conitec. But how we address this, who will assess this, how is the way they will assess, what is the flow, what's the process, is there a defined deadline, is there transparency? Do we have some admin process in Conitec? I think that this is another topic of these discussions. How to address the technologies that are out of scope of Conitec, but should be addressed. Have some assessment study of this request, of this demand. I have brought 2 other numbers about the source. Here are the main ones that are asking for requests. So we have the internal from the technical areas of the ministry and also external ones. If you go deeper about these requests, we see that a lot of internal ones were because of updates of assistential programs. So Conitec was requested for this structure, for programs as Living Better, Better at Home. And regarding recommendation, we have the same value, the one for favorable for incorporation, and 50 were not favorable to incorporate these technologies. And it's important to highlight here that a lot of these technologies, they are not assessed in the model of a report about product, because it depends how was the entry of this request. So sometimes you're going to have devices that are being assessed, but are being assessed through other types of reports. What's quite common is the procedure report. I have just 2 examples. The 2 are recently for the ones for radical prostatectomy assisted by robots, and it was analyzed in another moment as a product to incorporate the robot. And the second request, it was the demand to create a procedure, and obviously we have the robot in this report. So about procedure, that was to incorporate the implement to the aortic valve. So it's hard to remove the products from the procedures. Because of these procedures, it requires technologies. They are done through these medical devices. And now we have, after these 11 years of Conitec, we are moving forward the enhancement of this commission. And we had two new things this year. We have a law that changed some characteristics of Conitec. And we have one that we have this, we don't have a unique one to bring more specificity. So we always had this that would assess any type of demand in any topic. So the same that assessed that would talk about medicine was the same that we would discuss for products, for health products. And we know, we have seen that the product to assess technologies, the methodologies of assessing technologies for medical device, it has some particularities. We have meaningful differences comparing to the medicine when you compare the devices and the medicine. So to bring a specific committee was necessary, and this was happening in international agencies. So now we have, because of this act, we are replacing this that was a unique one for three technical committees with the topic that are specific to bring more efficiency and agility, and also to bring more expertise for these assessments. So we are going to have this because the act will start in 120 days, and we have 90 days to Conitec to present the new requirements, how it's going to work, and we have now a committee for products and procedures, a meaningful advancement for the medical device sector. And besides creating this new configuration, have a unique for this theme committees. So we have from 13 members, we're going to have 15, including the evaluation nucleo that are related to the Brazilian Department of Assessment of Technologies. I think that's an important point because the methodologies to bring them this discussion, it brings this that can be more restricted, how we can execute this assessment methodology, thinking about the specificities, the characteristics, particularities of the medical devices, and besides the Brazilian Medical Society that will be part of this committee.
Something new that the decree brings. I would highlight some of the news because there are so many aspects, which is the purpose of the complex, the industrial complex for medical devices. And another thing that I would highlight is that the people that comprise the committee needs a specificity didn't used to happen. So now the nomination for the committee has to be of someone who is experienced in the area, who has capacitation in the field, or who has a master's or doctor degree in the area they are being responsible for. It's important, of course, to have a space where you're going to discuss medical devices, but there must be people that has the expertise on the subject. And something that will improve will be the process of transparency and the distribution of Conitec to evaluate the demand will count on the Brazilian network of technology. And now it's going to be done in a more specified way. So we can see here a lot of advance in terms of technical competence and a thematic committee for healthcare products. I think what Carlos Gouveia mentioned with the improvement of Conitec for the incorporation or for the assessment in terms of technologies that may not be so effective and broaden the use. So if we have a technology in the system that could have a broader use for other kinds of actions, and the dynamic of the productive sector and the technological innovation require monitoring studies. So we have to study new technologies. What are the emerging technologies? How much it can impact in the services? Are we ready to accommodate the new technologies? And also carry out studies. After the incorporation, after it was defined, how do we implement the technology inside the service, on the edge, inside the healthcare facility? Because there is a chain, there is a huge bridge to be crossed between a decision by Conitec and the technology being installed in the service. So the monitoring is not only of the technological horizon, but how the technology is embedded in the systems. Another point I would like to mention is the engagement of the patient, the social participation, and the presence of experts. So today we have a database of experts in specific area, people that are interested in the area that may contribute with the process. And the agenda I'd like to bring is the Digital Health Strategy Agenda of Brazil from 2020 to 2028 that has some axes that are very important. The big action axles that we have. And in terms of health innovation, I brought two priorities. One, the value-based health. I'm sorry, Dr. Fotini, people are guiding me about the time. Unfortunately, if you could just speed up because you have been ahead of your time. Sorry, but because we have limited time for each speaker. Okay, so health-based in value, you have a need of system that generates data about the results of the use of technology, and the strategy expects it to be a priority initiative, considering also in terms of assessment and incorporation, how you have, how you boost and you foster innovation. So you need an industrial agenda thinking of the technologies. And finally, we have a study published by a friend of ours from Anvisa that maps all the systems and database of medical devices in Brazil to compare it with the other countries. So how is Brazil and how other countries are? And so we have the data source catalog with 262 IT systems, besides those 12 that were associated to medical device data. Compared to other countries, Brazil has systematized its information. We don't have information that would help the technological management and the results of the use of the technology. This is information about payment and reimbursement, and the challenges are how to generate positive data with standardization, interoperability, and quality, relating the scientific rigor. Thank you. And here is my contact. Sorry, doctor, to interrupt you, but I do believe that what you showed us really rectifies the complexity of our sector and how much we have to do and how difficult it is. I would just comment when you mentioned inclusion of new technologies and mentioned TAVI. This was a landmark. TAVI is a product that is in the market since 2013, but it was just incorporated 1 year ago, and now we are facing a serious difficulty because the inclusion price added in the SUS table that enables the use of it. So we were able to integrate an extremely important technology, like the robotic aspect you mentioned for Uru, but now we are in this position of how to serve with the prices that were applied there. Thank you for your presentation, Doctor, and I'm sorry for the interruption. I know it's a lot to say, and it's generating us many separate webinars. I was discussing in parallel. There are so many topics to be discussed. I mentioned that with Eduardo as well, because we have to open new webinars because of the complexity of all. And so, Eduardo, thank you for being here with us. And I would like to really ask something of your presentation that I believe will contemplate all that. But the end of all is how to integrate what you're going to say with the productive sector and the private sector, how to put the academia, the private and the government sectors all together. Good morning. I would like to thank ABIIS for the invitation and greet all my colleagues in the panel. I believe that Gouveia mentioned it very well when you're talking about medical devices. Simple technologies going from a tongue supporter to very evolved technology. So we have a wide range of products and complexities. And when we look for the development of the industry, you have to see how it works. We come from the mid-50s together with a process of late industrialization process of Brazil. And in the same time, we have the first post-graduation programs and the beginning of the research institutes in Brazil. But this model back then has a trajectory of the Brazilian industry with the academia that had never really got together. All of this starts being questioned and being claimed by the society, by the academy and the public, the private sector in the early 2000s, when we start talking about innovation. And when we talk about innovation, remember, we are talking about products getting to the market. So research becoming an invoice. So innovation happens when the product's in the market, when the population can access it, and as a consequence, when the industry starts producing and generating demands for qualified job, qualified income, and providing dynamic for the society in a positive way. As I mentioned, the trajectory of the innovation in Brazil and the discussion of innovation in Brazil happened late. The turning point for us was 2004 with the law of innovation that broke many paradigms in Brazil. And a second moment, we have an improvement of this framework in the National Congress in a discussion with society, with the framework of science and technology. So legally, it solved many things. In the operational aspect, we still have to think of how to relate all these in real aspects. So talking about medical device, it's a sector whose dynamic of innovation is connected to the development of innovation of other industries. We are talking about materials, of software, of electronics, automation. So when you develop a sector, you need a range of broad information. And so you don't have this integration between research, development, and the application in the industry. Things don't happen. And looking at the scenario and having a broader idea, you know that industrial activities in Brazil in the 80s used to be 1/3 of the GDP of Brazil. In the 90s, it's this structure, and now it's less than 9% of Brazilian GDP for industrial activities, which is bad, because we see that for many years, a discussion of medical devices, and of course, the medication is separate. It's another muscle that you have for medication, but for medical device, we start to see a trend of mentioning that device becomes a commodity and everybody can do it. And that's not what happened in the pandemic. It was clear for us. Until then, chains that were well structured and consolidated just crumbled because of high demand. And first off, because there was no specific medication to treat the patient, no vaccination to protect the population. So the first approach of therapeuticals would be based on medical devices. So the large producers who would be considered the reserve in this scale couldn't do it. And so we observed that the countries as a whole, especially the main actors in medical devices, have strong policies to bring their manufacturing of what they call, what they consider strategic. This is a world consensus of us to have a basic set of devices to provide safety for the population in events like what's happening with COVID-19, and another one, which is the monkeypox, that requires important attention and can be a complication. In these cases, we need robust industry, and it's no point to do that by just producing and not having any control. For you to have a strong technological base in the short and long run, this approximation of industry and academia have to work well. You need strategy behind, you need a state and strategies behind all that. And today you see the industry of technology as a whole, and you see first a new dynamic in the world order, and the reflex of that is the war in Ukraine. And in this path, we have a discussion in the access to raw material, to cutting edge knowledge, all of this that the medical industry requires, especially for medical devices. We are checking, we see the problem with semiconductors. And so when you think of all of these devices, they use semiconductors. We talked today about installing a foundry. We're talking about dozens of billions of dollars of investment. And you have that in the hands of few countries, few stakeholders that can provide that. And they are using the technical competence and the infrastructure they have as a bargain currency to sell commodity, but also bring qualified investments. For example, some companies that we need to develop some technologies, the deadlines we have to predict a shipping is 52 months. It's not reasonable for production nor to develop innovation. So what some countries do is demand you have on site the factory of modules, components, and plates. So, and then you have access to these components, and then you can add value of the product in the country the semiconductor is produced. So what we have to do, I can't repeat what everything that was mentioned over the day, but first you need a taxation policy that is favorable for the long run in terms of consolidating the health industry in the country. And I hope I have answered your question. You did answer, and actually, particularly, I agree 100% to what you said. So I think the pandemic showed us the difficulty of what would be the globalism that would be amazing. But no, everybody needs everything of everything, a little of everything, because each government needs to define and have correct planning of the sequence of the evolution of its own industry. Brazil on these sides can't be a country of services. Our industry has to be strong. We can't be peripheral. Thank you, Eduardo. And now I would like to talk to Ronaldo, who is the representative of one of, or maybe one of the largest companies of medical devices in Brazil. And the question, just to start off, would be, based on what Eduardo said and the analysis you can carry out, how does the large industry think of the future with the limitations we have with raw material and the limitations of economical barriers and all that? So how does a large industry like the one you work at can maintain the same level, facing all the difficulties that we are. And the war and the pandemic show us that the struggle is real. So what kind of thinking the company has? It's a difficult question, but we wanted to hear from you too. Ronaldo, thank you. Good morning. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation and to talk on behalf of Johnson & Johnson. And I will start with your question. The truth is that it does, and it has always done. When we had 30% of industrialization in the country, and now that we have 9%. Johnson & Johnson is in Brazil with its plant for almost 70 years, with a beautiful factory that you see at São José dos Campos, and we are very proud of it because it is a factory, the only one in the world that's up to the day concentrates our 3 economical segments. So you have 16 factories that are working in medication, medical device, and consumer products. So it's a potence, and it have 3,600 employees working directly. So for the city, it's very important. For us and for the country, it's important too.
This is the contribution we export nowadays, for example, with the difficulties that we have. We export for more than 30 countries the products that are manufactured there, talking only about the medical device. So we go through this every day when we are thinking about a company as Johnson & Johnson. And we need to try to see Johnson's contribution in the universe of what is medical device, as it was mentioned, since the more common ones up to the most advanced ones, of a market of $10 billion per year, 80,000 sanitation records. There is no way of handling this context, this reality, in a simple way. It's always going to be difficult, complicated, but having heard what we have heard today and going back, thinking about the speeches that we had earlier, I'm optimist on one side of seeing that there's a legitimate interest, a real interest of working in a convergence. So if it's true that the pandemic brought a lot of challenges of the point of view of public health, it also proved, as was mentioned, that this global articulation, it needs to be well done. So the countries noticed that if you depend on few sources to be your supplier is not a smart decision. This was done in an economical logic that at that moment, maybe it made sense, but the pandemic showed that this is not the only path. We need to consider other things. The companies also had this perception. And this, to say the least, it opened an opportunity to Brazil. So if we have open opportunities in what we hear from the authorities, thinking about working in a convergence that's for regulation, it makes me optimist that we are in the good path. So we have a guidance, indication that on the side of the country, there is this awareness, the intelligence of working in a regulatory act that we'll discuss to other countries and make easier the integration of this productivity capacity. Because Brazil receives investments, and I have talked about the numbers of Johnson & Johnson just invest in Brazil, not because just we are an empathy people, even though we are, it's not because of that, it's for economical reason. And for the skills of the people that work in Johnson, they convince the ones that make the investment decisions that yes, it's worth it to invest in Brazil. And this will always happen. It has always happened. And as Johnson will be here and other companies with our profile, it's going to happen. So we have this diplomacy about the company, about the corporation, that we compete with other countries, trying to show that Brazil deserves this investment. And obviously, We are successful in some areas, we have some failures, and we continue working. So we don't say that everything's just great and all of that. We have opportunities of improvement. I bring here an example for us. We're talking about our suture factory. Now we estimate that every 10 surgeries in the world, 4 use sutures from Johnson & Johnson, which is a great number. We export and these needles and they are re-exported. So it's an important reach. It's a commitment of the company with the country. And on our side, now I'm talking as a Brazilian person, as a Johnson employee, and also on the global Johnson behalf, the interested in seeing Brazil a place with potential to continue receiving investments, to strengthen our production capacity, and become a more relevant player when compared to other countries. We have a long way, but I think that we are in a favorable direction. This is what I see. Before closing, to talk a little bit about the challenges. So we have our exporting, about the sutures and needles. When we remove a suture from the factory and send to Argentina, it takes 8 weeks to get there. So there's a stock, exporting, and this could be better. And cost, in the end of the day, it's a cost. So when I go to the city of São José, where is the problem? And they bring me examples like this to show we have some opportunities to expand this for a macro view, not only about a reality. Again, I try to get references in the material that ABIIS developed in the pillars that it can identify space for improvement, room for improvement, and I got 3 things about taxation. Every year we have discussions about renewing this. Every year we have a taxation structure that's fragile. And imagine a corporation that's global to say today the tax is 0, 1 year from now can be 18, 19, 20, 21. So it brings an uncertainty that not makes our work easier to sell the country. So, of course, it's not a privilege of the medical device sector when we have an open discussion about taxation renovation. Senator, so you know about this. How many sectors go to you to ask for some attention? With a similar speech, we generate a lot of job positions, and who will be the privileged one? If we had an easy answer, it would be easier, but even we have the challenge, we need to face this challenge. This was mentioned by ABIIS, and we in the company, we feel this in our daily routine. So we have taxation, that's an opportunity. We have the idea of changing the bureaucracy, decreasing the amount of bureaucracy. So the importing of raw material and exporting finished products, in the end of the day, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about industrial development. It's impossible to have total autonomy in manufacturing goods and importing a few things. So that's the key. If you're importing raw material and exporting finished products, that's where you generate wealth. So we have a lot of opportunities to develop this area. And another thing that was mentioned here, that's about the technological assessment for medical device. I think of the point of view of medicines, and now I'm talking with the authority of working in a company that has medicine. So we look at these 2 perspectives. So in the area of medicine, I think that we are in a more comfortable situation. We are a little bit better. Of course, there are some adjustments, but I think that things are more evolved. In the medical device sector, we have great challenges yet. I think that we need to be more sensitive about this, and maybe we can work together, because industrial development, and the senator knows of this too, it goes through the state, how the state is important not only to define the policy, but it's also a buyer, especially in the health area. How we can use this, because the purchase will be done. So how we connect this purchase with the development policy for the industrial development, so the companies that can make the local production operation also be part of this process in a more competitive and more efficient way. I will stop now. But just to give a context how we see the problem. I think that your answer, at least to me, it was quite clear, and I would like to make 3 comments. The first one is to be happy to listen from the representative of a company, the continuity in our country is what you have said. This is quite important to us. Second is to demystify that national company and foreign company. I consider the foreigners companies here national companies. They produce here, they export from here, they bring wealth to the country. So it's a paradigm that needs to be broken. We are a health industry. If there's a bigger power in the rest of the world, or our company here that's here with the national capital, doesn't matter. It's just one thing. And all of this needs to converge to the good for health, to the care of the patient. I think that's the most important that I have heard from you. Thank you very much. Now, Alexandre, I think Alexandre can bring to us and show to us the integration. Alexandre, as you are the CEO of a big company, you're also a professor, so you have academy in your DNA. So how is the situation of integration? How we go from, look, this should be like this, and we really do things? Good morning. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me from ABIIS, Carlos, José Márcio. Thank you very much. I think that's a unique opportunity to be here contributing and also learning about the medical devices. I'm in love by the industry of medical device. I tell this to my wife, to my daughter, when you go to a hospital in Germany, in China, and you see a neonatal ICU manufactured in Brazil, it's really moving. It's really nice. As I have said, I'm really in love with this. I think that this question, not only this question, but what we're discussing here in this panel, what's this future? How we're going to make this happen? I represent LabTest, the national industry from the state of Minas Gerais. We have some maturity. We export to 20 countries, more than 20 countries. It's an industry that was founded by 2 pathologists that are not with us anymore, but I remember I had the opportunity to meet them, and they were saying what you mentioned about how hard it is to import. But we are not a pharmaceutical industry, but it's not like that. Medical device is different. So we have interesting stories about the raw material that we use to import that was regulated by the army. Just to get the license, it was 90 days to get the license to import this raw material. So to develop this thinking, I would like to put 2 sides of this story, this history. Thinking about a more endogenous point of view of the sector. The sector of medical device in Brazil, it has hundreds of companies in a medium and small companies that had an income of 20 million per year with 20 employees, 30 employees. So you have a challenge, a difficulty related to how to scale this. We're talking about smaller companies that the management has a degree of complexity that's huge. Companies that import, export, that are in the regulation sector, a degree of competitivity that's quite higher. So it's a great challenge. Added to other aspects. Talking about the sector, about the logistic of supply chain that was mentioned here this morning, a complex chain, a complicated chain, a long chain, and about innovation. We need to innovate all the time. It's a diversified knowledge, as the professor mentioned earlier, and it demands a lot of people. And on the other side, not in the endogenous way, but thinking about the health sector, we have the relationship of the patient with the health changing a lot. Of course, the pandemic brought a different scenario, but even before the pandemic, the access to information, it makes the person to be more aware about the health, having more information. The relationship of this patient with the providers, labs, hospitals. I know owner of labs, they say, Alexandre, in the past, I would open the door of the lab, there was a line here, people would go to the lab. Nowadays, no, I need to go after my patient. So this is changing, and it's changing fast. And it's good, because this is an evolution, this is part of that, but it's different. And the other side is the strength of the service providers, and we're talking about giants, about huge movements happening, consolidation, and so on. And on one side, we have, of this more endogenous point of view, this more fragile condition, and on the market side, a movement of consolidation, and generates an unbalanced situation. As about the pharmaceutical industry, it brings this because it doesn't have this problem. My colleague mentioned different situations, and the medical device industry lives with that all the time. So trying to answer the question and contributing, I think that there are some aspects. First of all, we need to think in a MO as an ecosystem. It's not one industry, 2 or 10 industries providing 1 or 2 technologies or 10 technologies. What is the ecosystem? How it should be created to provide solution for this patient, for this service provider, in a way that it will bring not only quality. When I'm talking about quality, I'm talking about technology. And as my friend used to say, this is a long path because we have more new things, more technologies, the access itself. Because if I think that 200 million, 220 million people, we know that the access is different. Some are more privileged than others. So this quality, access, and sustainability that need to work together, and it's not easy. I think that all of us here that live with this in our daily routine, and we need to find solutions. I think that one thing would be this ecosystem point of view. It was not one company, we have different companies. We would have not only the knowledge of biotechnology, but also digitalization, artificial intelligence, machine learning, Web3, all of this together to try to find solutions that can be sustainable and that can make this industry move forward. And trying to be more specific regarding your question, we had in the last years, especially during the pandemic, we had a huge challenge. A product cycle, as Cassio mentioned, of 3 years, 1 or 2 years, it's development. And we didn't have this time during the pandemic. We should be able to do things happen faster. So I'd like to mention Augusto and Daniela were here earlier. we as regulated, we need to recognize when the regulator, where the regulatory agency as Anvisa and INS, they did an amazing work. It's remarkable. We talk to people from other countries, suppliers, and they say, how is in Brazil this regulator part? Anvisa, is it complicated? And now we're proud of saying, no, the regulatory agency, we consider more agile. I'm in the sector for 23 years. I remember how it was. It changed a lot. And what we have heard from Daniela and Augusto, it shows that this is happening and this is really nice. I think as regulated, we need to enjoy the opportunity and comment on that. And I think that the solution goes through this ecosystem assembly and the interface of innovation about academy and industry. What we're able to do in this short period of time was through accelerators, hubs of technology, startups, we were able to make this gap between the solution, the innovative solution that the academy offers, and what the industry puts there on the shelf to become an invoice. This gap that is big is not easy. And sometimes for the industry, it's difficult to take the role and the risk of going to this trajectory. We need a lot of energy, a lot of resources. Sometimes an ecosystem with startups, hubs, biotechnology.
And when entities, that it helps a lot. So I believe the solution goes through that to creating the bridge between the academy and the commerce really become something. The industry of medical devices is not so large, so taking a step back for it is difficult. So this bridge is really important. So if we can create those ecosystems, we can be very successful. And this will happened with us during the pandemic and in other industries that are close to us. And it was gratifying to see all that. I hope I was able to answer, and I'm available. Thank you, Alexandre. You did answer my question. I believe we have to start living, as I mentioned, the look, but really talking about the effective way of making things happen. So just to complete something that Ronaldo mentioned, to say that medication is something that we know. And in our entity that is part of ABIIS, we created this year a campaign trying to show the population what medical device is, what the importance it has. And so everybody will have an example of, people that don't know that they are inside their body and they know the name of the medication, the doctor, the hospital they carried the surgery, but they don't know they have a medical device, temporary or not, it doesn't matter. So we are starting a simple campaign to show the importance of our sector. So I had an agreement with the senator. I don't know if you call him senator or minister in his saying. And for us, it's important because we have someone that was part of the two of the three powers, the executive and now the legislative powers. And there was a proposal for him to be the last one to really conclude our event, so he could know what everybody was going to say and see everybody's perspective. So my question for you, Mr. Senator, is facing everything you've heard and imagining the difficulties we have inside the Brazilian healthcare system. We know our system is relevant and the high complexity of SUS is one of the best areas, but we still have gaps between the low and average complexity. We have lines, we have things to be solved, we still have some locks. So I believe that Dr. Fotini mentioned very well the difficulty to incorporate new technologies. And Eduardo also mentioned everything that today integrates. medical device from the integration of other sectors. So my question for you, Mr. Senator, can we solve this problem? How can we leave theory and go to practice? I know many things are being done, of course. The pandemic showed us that we can do a lot that we are not. Such a as a country, we are not so far behind. So with a country with 220,000 inhabitants, providing health to all of them is not an easy task. So let me hear a little about the future from you, because you are the one representing us and who can help us as entities and as individuals. And you can understand everything we're saying. So the floor is yours to conclude the event. Well, first of all, let me thank ABIIS' invitation to be here and participate in this round of conversation that is very interesting, very enriching. And I start by answering your question by saying that more than a desire or any subjective idea, this is all I need for our country. Today, the health system we have and the economical and industrial complex of health are not problems, they are solutions for our country. And we have tried, and I'm saying from the discussion we have had with the parties that comprise the alliance that supports President Lula's campaign, but also talking to corporate sectors, and we also have a forecast to have a meeting with the president in all the sector of healthcare, but also the academic sector and several other sectors that it seems like there is a single agenda in the country. All points are consensus. They need to strengthen their system. So for the strengthening, we need to reinforce the funding process for the system, which means rediscussing the taxation policy, the fiscal policy of our country, and we have the urgent need for Brazil to regain its economical growth, generate jobs, income, and reduce the inequalities that are very important. So finding a point in which the system works well and is one of the mechanisms to generate development is essential. And that's where you have the debate, not only about the medical device sector, but the whole economical complex. This is a consensus. We are talking about the municipal and state secretaries, and all the proposals of actions are there bringing the need of strengthening the industrial complex in healthcare, not only because we have experienced everything you've mentioned of what we've been through during the pandemic, but also because it is a segment that can quickly help in the process of economic growth and the development of our country. After all, health represents around 9 to 10% of the GDP. It's not little, it's a lot. Health represents 10% of the jobs, the formal employee, the formal job positions that we have. They are formal and qualified, and we have a public system that in relative terms is one of the largest one. In absolute terms, it is the largest one, and it requires important investments. And from those investments and from the role the state can cause the development, we can advance and have important responses. So the benefits of an industrial policy for the country is shown in different angles. We can better serve the population, improve the population's access to treatment, diagnosis that are modern to solve problems. And at the same time, we are going to be promoting the process of economical development and growth for the country. We understand that for this complex to be strong, we need to be able to attract investments, international and local investments, and that's why we need to solve some problems. I talk about what we have built in the public policy aspect, which has been built in the dialogue with the economic and the science and technology parts. An industrial complex for health inside that front is being discussed in the participation of the health coordination with health, economy, and innovation technology coordination. This is important for Brazil to strengthen the industrial complex. And that means, first, that we have to have incentives and implement a real policy of science and technology and innovation development. Brazil is using this situation to show how much we've lost in the past years. We are a part of BRICS, 5 countries that have different development levels in comparison to China, for instance, but has many similarities in the field of development of science and technology specifically. From the 5 countries of BRICS, 3 of them produced vaccines, and Brazil is not among them. China produced at least 2, India produced their own vaccines and others in association, and Russia produced 2. Only us and South Africa did not develop vaccination. We produced because we associated and brought technology, which was very right to do so, but that is a demonstration that we lost the capacity of development because we reduced the investments in science and technology. For a country that in public and private sectors of healthcare to the population has a gigantic market, we have the capacity, because of the power of the state, in a sense of helping, fostering and promoting that development, and we have an important role to play. But not only that, we also know that it's important to have an economic policy that can privilege industrial activities, especially in this area, meaning to debate taxes, simplifying taxes, meaning identifying which sectors of the industry and of the economy need some kind of different treatment, and health needs that, not only because we are talking about something that is essential to promote the health of the population, but also because it can quickly respond to the need of growth and development in economy. So simplifying taxes, clearly defining inside the taxation policy that we should work with the possibility of income taxation or of sectors that today are clearly privileged, but the production needs to be discharged. These services need to be discharged from the perspective of the payroll, as well as from the perspective of the access to fundings in lower costs and the broad use of our purchase power. So we believe we need to have an intelligent taxation policy for this sector. Today, some sectors are have benefits without bringing the same social and economic impact than others. So another important thing is the matter of regulation. We need to strengthen and improve Brazil's regulation in terms of the healthcare area. In terms of innovation, if we want to innovate, we need to have a policy in terms of patents that is more agile than what we have today. INPI today can't respond to all because there is a shortage of people, and so we could be registering and having significant patents. We have this limitation. Like from the legal perspective, we have to discuss something that goes through the executive, but also through the National Congress. And that discusses the subject of patents, so we can have legal safety to those who will invest and also foster investments in innovation. Another important thing is the recognition that Anvisa has in international terms, because today it participates on institutions that work directly in inspection of good practices, of good manufacturing practices, of health equipment, and the participation institutions that find the standards for the regulation. However, Anvisa today is an agency that has limited staff. Today, I know we advanced in terms of deadlines, and this was a struggle, but we can be even more effective. We can adopt what was called in the pandemic, something that broke the resistance of the reciprocal recognition of agencies that develop good practices, that have strict regulations. So we have to see what we can work, because for the medical device sector, it's essential. We can work more quickly to register products, and from the ANS perspective that has a deficit of staff, and we have to advance in some replacements and updates of the staff in terms of legislation. And finally, understand that the policy we want to develop to strengthen the healthcare assistance to the population and the basic care in the medium complexity area goes through some actions that have everything to do with the segment. For example, the pandemic was very harmful for some situations, but we learn important things from it. First, that the SUS, the Brazilian healthcare system, has a visibility and a vision of the society that got much more in these periods than in years that what the ministry tries to show what SUS is. So experiencing this situation was very important. Today, there are some voices that really vocalize the need of this system to be strengthened. So, of course, we have more capacity to claim more resources to the healthcare system. Today, I see people that used to say that health was just expenses, that was shallow. They say it is an investment. So this is very important. And it means that we have to acquire the competence, the capacity, equipment to improve this assistance. On the other hand, other taboos was broken, like there is no way of improving access to people to the basic care, to specialized care, if we don't have a strong system of digitalization in our healthcare system. And then we dialogue again with the sector. So these are our visions. General view, we've developed a program that is very summarized, but has a consensus, and we want to unfold all that in case President Lula wins in an action plan that will be built with many hands, including the private sector that is essential for the healthcare system. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, you answered, Senator. I would like to say that I think that you were able to provide a perfect diagnosis of what our area needs nowadays. You were able to define this, and this was well put in your speech. You have our needs quite clear. So what I have said, that I think that maybe now all of this maybe have taught us, I can say a little bit more tragic, the pandemic, but how important we are as a sector. We are not expenses. We don't expend the money of the country. We invest in our country. This is the great difference that I see. And I'm really pleased to hear this from you. We know that there's going to be a support. This in our events that you were with me. You showed this knowledge of this sector. So to us, it's important to hear this. It's important to live this with this awareness. If I should give a suggestion, I think that you have mentioned in the end to work together. This would be my suggestion, to create a group of work of the industry with the hospitals would be part of this, the industry, the medical community would be part of that. This is the only way that we can get to an agreement. If just one wants to do what they want, the community of health as a whole, if this was together in one conversation, a lot of things could be solved. So I'd like to thank you for being here with us, to thank Dr. Fontini that's hearing us, Eduardo, Ronaldo, Alexandre. To me, it was an honor to be here with you. And I would like to leave a suggestion for José Márcio, that's to create webinars, because it's a big topic, it's quite complex. So we cannot hear Eduardo for 5 minutes, Dr. Fontini 10 minutes, the senator 10 minutes, and so on. So I think that we have a group here, of course, with the people from ABIIS and all the speakers here, to get everyone together. Maybe this is the beginning of doing something with a lot of people involved. Thank you very much.
Conclusivas, as considerações finais do nosso...
So we had the final remarks from our president. So, Mr. Carlos Gouveia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for this panel and all the previous panels. I think that we had high-level discussions. Of course, the time, Sergio, it was not enough. We need more, but I think that the challenge is accepted. All of us are responsible to creating policies for a country that we love and that we want to make it even better for next generations. So I think that the result for this event is quite rich. It's going to be available in the social media, but also I think that we should continue working in proposals that can become actions with a lot of people involved. So besides the webinars, I think that documents, proposals, white papers, it can be individualized by each one of the lines that we have discussed here. So ABIIS will be in charge of that, to bother you a little bit more in certain moments, to help us to continue with this discussion, with this elaboration, and to propose something that can be implemented in our country. We are responsible for a better health, for a more sustainable health, and that a population that can live a lot of years producing in the suitable way, generating income, living well, much better and longer. So I thank you all. I think everyone that was here, that Dr. José Márcio, the entire team, the translators, the ceremony master, everyone from the technical team that gave some help us to make this possible. It's a pleasure and it's a satisfaction, and I hope that you have enjoyed. Thank you very much and see you in the next one.
A Aliança Brasileira da Indústria Inovadora em Saúde reúne as principais entidades representantes de dispositivos médicos no país, setor que acompanha você a vida inteira.
Você usa um dispositivo médico do primeiro respiro ao último suspiro. Basicamente tudo que é usado em saúde que não seja medicamento. A gente tem cerca de 70 mil produtos registrados na Anvisa. Isso é uma enormidade. O nosso mercado anual no Brasil está em torno de 11,5 bilhões de dólares ano. A gente gera 140 mil empregos diretos e 255 mil indiretos.
Foi em 2011 que a Aliança nasceu para unir e direcionar forças ao segmento. A Braide, a Divamed, CBDL. Juntas formam a ABIIS e representam mais de 550 empresas no Brasil.
A ABIIS, como aliança, ela realmente foi uma grande conquista para trazer o tema dispositivos médicos e diagnóstico para a mesa. Até então, nós não conseguíamos muito espaço, toda e qualquer discussão dentro da área da saúde, junto ao governo, ao Congresso, sempre se referia ao quê? A medicamentos, indústria farmacêutica.
A ABIIS produz dados e estudos para formular propostas para aprimoramento de políticas públicas em saúde para o Estado e a sociedade. Um dos principais documentos elaborados pela Aliança foi o Saúde 4.0, com impacto inclusive em outros países. Mais recentemente, um novo documento foi apresentado com os novos desafios e oportunidades para o setor.
Nossas propostas são ouvidas por órgãos reguladores e pelo Congresso, e trabalhamos para inserir o setor de dispositivos médicos na agenda estratégica do Brasil como um setor vital para o desenvolvimento humano, social e econômico do nosso povo.
Dispositivos médicos ajudam a limitar os custos do cuidado de pacientes, ao possibilitar diagnóstico precoce e monitoramento. E as novas tecnologias proporcionam avanços para o Brasil e o mundo.
A ABIIS aumentou a coerência das recomendações do setor privado para uma política de saúde pública eficaz e trabalhou para implementar normas internacionais para saúde, inovação, ética, comércio internacional dentro desse sistema, trabalhando juntos para eliminar todo tipo de barreira às tecnologias médicas que salvam e melhoram vidas dos pacientes.